What if everything you thought you knew about the ancient world, the gods, temples, and rituals, was a lie? Beneath the marble columns and sacred chants, there were blood-soaked secrets buried for centuries. Tonight, we uncover the shocking truth behind 25 ancient cults that practiced human sacrifice. These are not rumors, but verified facts hidden in history's shadows. From Mesopotamia to the Andes, these practices were systemic, not isolated. Join us as we dig beneath the surface to reveal the darkest corners of the ancient world. Welcome to tonight's exploration. If you're ready for unsettling truths, hit subscribe and let's dive in. The air hangs thick with copal incense, its sweet smoke curling upward toward a sky painted in shades of crimson and gold. Drum beats reverberate through the stone plaza, deep, rhythmic, relentless, as the sun begins its final descent over Tenochtitlan. The great temple rises before you, its twin staircases climbing toward the heavens, each step worn smooth by countless feet, countless processions, countless offerings. The year is 1487, and tonight, the dedication of the renovated temple will be completed in a ceremony that will reshape how we understand the Aztec relationship with their gods. The official story you learned in school probably painted the Aztecs as a sophisticated civilization, masters of agriculture, brilliant astronomers, architects who built floating gardens and engineered aqueducts that would impress modern urban planners. All of this is true, but it's also profoundly incomplete. The dark truth? Human sacrifice wasn't some occasional ritual performed in desperate times. It was the beating heart of Aztec religion, the fundamental transaction that kept their universe functioning. The Aztecs believed the sun god Huitzilopochtli required human blood to fight his nightly battle against darkness, and without it, the sun simply wouldn't rise. Let that sink in, not metaphorically, literally. No sacrifice, no sunrise, no world. The evidence comes from multiple sources that cross-verify each other in unsettling detail. The Codex Mendoza, created just decades after the Spanish conquest, documents the tribute system that funneled prisoners from conquered territories directly to the sacrificial altars. The Florentine Codex, compiled by the Franciscan friar Bernardino de Sahagún through interviews with Aztec elders, describes the rituals in clinical, devastating detail. Archaeological excavations at the Templo Mayor in Mexico City, beginning in 1978, have unearthed thousands of human remains, showing clear evidence of ritual sacrifice. Hearts removed, bodies carefully positioned, bones bearing distinctive cut marks. But here's what makes this truly haunting: the human details that survive in those sources. The victims weren't always prisoners of war. Sometimes they were volunteers, young men and women, who had been told since childhood that dying on the altar was the highest honor imaginable, a direct path to paradise. They were dressed in the finest feathers, their faces painted with sacred designs, their bodies adorned with jade and gold. Some accounts describe them dancing as they climbed the temple steps, performing one final ritual before the obsidian blade found their chest. The priests who performed the sacrifices weren't deranged killers. They were highly trained specialists who underwent years of education. They knew anatomy. They knew exactly where to cut, how to reach the heart, how to lift it, still beating toward the sun while reciting prayers whose words had been perfected over centuries. This wasn't chaos. This was precision. During the 4-day dedication ceremony of the Great Temple's expansion in 1487, Spanish chroniclers record that between 4,000 and 80,000 people were sacrificed. Modern historians debate the exact number. Mass sacrifice creates confusion in accounting, but even the most conservative estimates place it in the thousands. Prisoners were lined up in 4 columns, one for each staircase, waiting their turn as the altars ran red, and priests worked in shifts because exhaustion became a factor. The blood, according to Diego Duran's chronicle written in the 1570s, flowed down the temple steps in streams, pooling at the base. The Aztecs kept the skulls. The Tzompantli, the skull rack, stood near the great temple, displaying thousands of human crania mounted on wooden poles, a visible reminder of the bargain that kept the cosmos in motion. When Spanish conquistador Andrés de Tapia saw one in 1521, he attempted to count them and gave up after cataloging the arrangement, rows of skulls mortared together with lime, stretching further than he could accurately assess. But this devotion to blood, this systematic approach to human sacrifice, this belief that the gods required regular feeding to maintain reality itself, this wasn't unique to the Aztecs, not even close. The Mediterranean heat shimmers off the limestone altar, creating wavering mirages in the air above the talpate, the sacred precinct where the unthinkable becomes routine. The scent of burning cedar mixes with salt air carried from the harbor, and underneath it all, something else. Something acrid and wrong. It's 310 BCE in Carthage, the Phoenician city-state that controls maritime trade from North Africa to Iberia. And behind the walls of this prosperous metropolis, a ritual is unfolding that even their contemporaries found horrifying. The official narrative tells us about Carthage's legendary wealth, its merchant princes who traded purple dye and precious metals, its formidable navy that challenged Rome for control of the Mediterranean, its brilliant general Hannibal, who would later march elephants across the Alps. Carthage was sophisticated, cosmopolitan, powerful, a beacon of Phoenician culture. But archaeological evidence from multiple Tophet sites tells a different, darker story, one that Roman propagandists didn't need to exaggerate because the truth was damning enough. The cult of Baal Hammon, the primary deity of Carthage, demanded a price that seems almost incomprehensible: the lives of children, specifically the firstborn sons of the elite. This wasn't rumor spread by hostile Greeks or Romans. The evidence is literally buried in the ground. Beginning in 1921, archaeologists working at the Tophet site in Carthage began uncovering urns, hundreds of them, then thousands, containing the cremated remains of infants and young children. The site, active from approximately the 8th century BCE until the destruction of Carthage in 146 BCE, has yielded over 20,000 burial urns. The stelae, stone markers, erected above these urns often include inscriptions. They're not apologetic or ambiguous. They record the offerings plainly. To the Lady Tanit and to the Lord Baal Hammon, that which name vowed because they heard his voice and blessed him. The that which refers to the child in the urn below. Modern analysis of the remains shows that many of the children were newborns or slightly older infants, and crucially, they show no signs of disease or malformation. These were healthy children, sacrificed while alive. Greek and Roman sources describe the ritual in devastating detail. Diodorus Siculus, writing in the 1st century BCE, but drawing on earlier sources, describes a bronze statue of Baal Hammon with outstretched arms, heated from within by fire. The children were placed on the arms and rolled into the flames below, while drums and flutes played to drown out their screams. Plutarch, in his essay on superstition, corroborates the practice. The whole area before the statue was filled with a loud noise of flutes and drums, so that the cries and wailing should not reach the ears of the people. The human details that survive are what truly chill the blood. Some of the urns contain not just one child, but two, suggesting that when a family couldn't provide a child, they purchased one from the poor to fulfill their vow. The inscriptions record this pragmatically. Some offerings are described as substitute offerings, called MLK-MR, a substitute lamb, though the remains are unmistakably human. During times of crisis, military defeats, famines, plagues, the pace of sacrifices increased dramatically. When Agathocles of Syracuse besieged Carthage in 310 BCE, the city's elites sacrificed 200 children from the best families and added 300 more volunteers from common families, believing that the gods were angry because they had been offering purchased children rather than their own offspring. This detail comes from Diodorus Siculus's Library of History, and while historians debate some aspects of his account, the archaeological evidence confirms that periods of crisis correspond with increased burial activity at the Tophet. The practice wasn't hidden or shameful. The Tophet was in plain sight, a central religious site. The wealthy commissioned elaborate stelae to commemorate their offerings. This was public piety, civic duty, the proper way to ensure divine favor for themselves and their city. And across the Mediterranean, in the land of the pharaohs, another ancient power had its own relationship with blood and the gods. The Nile's current moves slowly past Abydos, carrying the scent of lotus blossoms and the distant sound of morning hymns from the temple complex. The year is approximately 2400 BCE during Egypt's Old Kingdom, and within the underground chambers beneath the Temple of Osiris, priests are preparing for a ritual that most Egyptians will never witness, never speak of, never acknowledge existed, though its echoes appear in texts carved into stone. The official version of Osiris worship is well known. He's the benevolent god of the afterlife, murdered by his brother Set, resurrected by his wife Isis, the divine judge who weighs hearts against the feather of Maat to determine who deserves eternal life. The cult of Osiris promised immortality to the faithful. It was about hope, about transcending death, about the triumph of order over chaos. But beneath this carefully cultivated image lay practices that the priests went to considerable effort to obscure, even as they documented them in texts meant only for initiates. The evidence for human sacrifice in Osirian rites is more fragmentary than the Aztec or Carthaginian cases, and that fragmentation is itself revealing. The pyramid texts, the oldest religious writings in the world, dating to around 2400 to 2300 BCE, contain passages that scholars have long found troubling. Utterance 273 and 274 make references to the king eating the gods, consuming their power, and being sustained by human offerings that are described in ways that suggest more than metaphor. At the royal tombs of the First Dynasty at Abydos, archaeological evidence shows subsidiary burials surrounding the main royal interment, servants, officials, and courtiers who were buried simultaneously with the pharaoh. For decades, Egyptologists debated whether these were natural deaths or sacrifices. The evidence increasingly supports the latter. The bodies show no signs of disease or violence, suggesting they were drugged or poisoned. They were buried at the exact same time as the primary burial, sealed together, and the practice abruptly ended after a few generations, suggesting it became socially unacceptable. The tomb of King Jer, c. 3000 BCE, includes 338 subsidiary burials. Later, religious texts contain fragments of darker practices that seem to reference actual rituals. The opening of the mouth ceremony, performed on mummies to restore their senses in the afterlife, includes passages about the red bull and the cutting of the throat that go beyond symbolic language. Papyri from the Middle Kingdom reference the enemy of Osiris being ritually executed during festivals, with the blood used to consecrate sacred spaces. The Festival of Osiris at Abydos, held annually, included mystery plays reenacting his death and resurrection. But inscriptions from participants suggest there was a hidden component, rituals performed in the underground galleries that weren't theatrical. One stela from the 12th dynasty mentions performing the secret, rites and spilling the blood of the enemies, in a context that scholars have long suspected means actual human offerings disguised as the ritual execution of criminals. The human element here is particularly haunting because it's deliberately obscured. The victims, if there were victims, left no names, no monuments, no acknowledgement. Unlike the Aztecs who celebrated their sacrificial victims or the Carthaginians who erected stelae, the Egyptians who practiced these rites worked to erase evidence. The priests who performed these rituals weren't the public priesthood, but inner circles, those who had passed through years of initiation, who knew the true mysteries versus the public liturgy. Herodotus, visiting Egypt around 450 BCE, recorded that the Egyptians told him they sacrificed pigs at the Osiris festival because Set had taken the form of a boar when he murdered Osiris. But he notes cryptically that there are other reasons which I know but prefer not to mention. This reticence, from a historian not known for restraint, suggests he learned of practices too sensitive to record openly. The critical detail, the practice appears to have existed at the religion's founding, and then gradually faded, replaced by animal sacrifice and symbolic substitutions. By the New Kingdom, the rituals were performed with effigies and bound, red-painted animals standing in for human victims. But the language of the rites retained the original phrasing, a fossil of darker practices preserved in amber. And this pattern of transformation from human to animal to symbolic sacrifice would appear again in cultures separated by thousands of miles. The jungle canopy above Yaxchilan filters the tropical sun into shafts of golden light that illuminate the rising smoke from copal fires. The year is 709 CE, and Lady Kaaba al-Shuk, wife of Shield Jaguar II, kneels before the temple entrance, preparing to perform a ritual that will connect her directly to the gods, a ritual that involves pulling a thorn-studded rope through her tongue. The official narrative about the Maya emphasizes their brilliance, their mathematical sophistication, their development of zero, their astronomical precision in tracking Venus and predicting eclipses, their elaborate calendar systems. They were philosophers, artists, architects who built cities that rose from the rainforest like stone dreams. This is all true. But the Maya were also deeply systematically devoted to blood, not just metaphorically, literally. Blood was the sacred substance that bridged the gap between the mortal and divine realms, and both nobles and captives supplied it in quantities that shock the modern imagination. The evidence is carved in stone and painted on pottery with remarkable frankness. At Yaxchilan, Lintel 24 shows Lady Kaab al-Suk in the act of bloodletting. She kneels before her husband, pulling a rope threaded with thorns through her pierced tongue, while blood drips onto bark paper in a basket. The date, the participants, and the ritual are all explicitly documented in the accompanying hieroglyphic text. This wasn't shameful or hidden. It was royal propaganda, meant to demonstrate the queen's piety and power. The Dresden Codex, one of the few surviving Maya books, contains almanacs for scheduling bloodletting rituals based on astronomical phenomena. Specific gods required blood on specific days in specific contexts. The records are meticulous, but auto-sacrifice, bloodletting performed on oneself, was just the foundation. The Maya also practiced human sacrifice, particularly of prisoners captured in warfare. The murals at Bonampak, painted around 790 CE, depict the entire sequence. The raid to capture prisoners, the torture and humiliation of captives, and finally their sacrifice, some beheaded, others having their hearts removed, all performed on the temple steps, while the royal court watches. The hieroglyphic inscriptions describe sacrifice using specific terminology. The glyph cha'ak means to chop and appears in contexts describing decapitation. Yats means to strike or hit, and references the act of removing a heart. These aren't euphemisms, they're technical terms for specific procedures. At the sacred cenote at Chichen Itza, dredging operations beginning in 1904 recovered human remains from the bottom of the water-filled sinkhole. Analysis shows that many were children and young adults, matching Spanish colonial accounts that describe the Maya throwing victims into the cenote during droughts to petition Chaak, the rain god. The physical evidence includes cut marks on bones, suggesting some victims were already dead when thrown in, while others may have drowned. Gold, jade, and incense accompanied the bodies, offerings to sweeten the petition. But here's what makes the Maya case particularly complex. The blood rituals existed on a spectrum. At one end, you had elite auto-sacrifice, painful but survivable, performed regularly by kings, queens, and nobles as part of their sacred duties. Blood from tongues, earlobes, and genitals was caught on bark paper, which was then burned to send the offering skyward. The vision serpent that appeared in the rising smoke, a hallucinatory experience enhanced by blood loss and possible entheogenic compounds, allowed communication with deified ancestors. At the other end, you had captive sacrifice, terminal, dramatic, public. The timing wasn't arbitrary. Major construction projects required dedication ceremonies involving multiple victims. Period endings in the complex Maya calendar demanded blood. Military victories were commemorated by sacrificing the captured enemy king in elaborate rituals that could last days. The Bonampak murals show one captive in the process of having his fingernails removed, a form of ritual torture that preceded death. Another figure lies curled on the steps, blood streaming from his hands. These images were painted for the Maya elite to view during ceremonies, a reminder of their power and piety. Spanish accounts from the 16th century, when colonizers encountered the Maya, describe active sacrificial practices. Diego de Landa, Bishop of Yucatan, wrote detailed descriptions of how priests would hold victims down on a stone altar while the chest was cut open and the heart removed, still beating and offered to the gods. His account matches the earlier evidence so closely that it's clear the practice had continued largely unchanged for centuries. The human detail that survives most powerfully. This wasn't about cruelty for its own sake. The Maya believed, genuinely and deeply, that human blood was necessary to maintain cosmic order. Without it, the gods would abandon humanity. Crops would fail, the sun might not return. Every drop spilled was an investment in survival. Every victim was a messenger to the divine. And yet, halfway across the world, in the forests of ancient Britain, another culture had reached remarkably similar conclusions about the necessity of blood. Fog drifts through the ancient oak grove, muffling sound and creating a gray twilight, even though it's midday. The year is approximately 60 CE, and Roman legionaries under the command of Gaius Suetonius Paulinus are preparing to assault the Druid sanctuary on the island of Mona, modern Anglesey, off the coast of Wales. What they're about to witness will shock even these hardened soldiers, men who've seen crucifixions, gladiatorial games, and the aftermath of pitched battles. The official narrative about the Druids comes largely from romanticized medieval sources and modern popular culture, wise philosophers in white robes, learned herbalists, spiritual guides who revered nature and served as intermediaries between the Celtic peoples and their gods. They were judges, teachers, and keepers of oral tradition in societies that didn't use writing for sacred knowledge. All of this contains truth. But the earlier sources, written by people who actually encountered the Druids, tell a darker story. Julius Caesar, in his account of the Gallic Wars written around 50 BCE, describes Druidic sacrifice with clinical precision. They have figures of vast size, the limbs of which are framed with twisted twigs and filled with living persons, which being set on fire, the men perish enveloped in the flames. They consider that the oblation of such as have been taken in theft or in robbery or any other offense is more acceptable to the immortal gods. But when a supply of that class is wanting, they have recourse to the oblation of even the innocent. The Wicker Man. Caesar is describing what may be the most iconic image of Celtic human sacrifice. Enormous human-shaped structures made of woven branches, filled with condemned criminals, or, when criminals weren't available, anyone would do, and set ablaze as an offering to the gods. He's not alone in this account. Strabo, writing around the same time, corroborates the practice and adds details about different methods. Some victims were shot with arrows, others impaled, others burned in the wooden colossi. The archaeological evidence is more ambiguous than for the Aztecs or Carthaginians, but it exists. At Lindo Moss in Cheshire, peat cutters in 1984 discovered the preserved remains of a man who died around 2 BCE, Lindo Man. The preservation was so complete that forensic analysis could determine the precise nature of his death. He had been struck twice on the head with a blunt instrument, garroted with a cord that was still around his neck, and his throat had been cut. Then he was deposited face down in the bog. This wasn't murder, this was ritual. The threefold death, bludgeoning, strangulation, and throat cutting, appears in Celtic mythology as a sacrificial pattern. His stomach contents showed traces of mistletoe, a plant sacred to Druids and mentioned by Pliny the Elder as central to their ceremonies. The location, a bog, a liminal space between earth and water, was sacred in Celtic cosmology. Lindo. Man was almost certainly a Druid sacrifice, possibly a volunteer from the upper classes given his well-manicured fingernails and lack of manual labor marks on his bones. Similar bog bodies across northern Europe show the same patterns: ritual killing, careful placement, deposition in sacred natural sites. At Tolen Man in Denmark, the preservation was so complete his face appears to be sleeping, the noose still tight around his neck. At Graubale Man, also in Denmark, his throat had been cut from ear to ear, but the most direct evidence comes from that assault on Anglesey in 60 CE. The Roman historian Tacitus, writing a few decades later, describes what the soldiers saw: groves devoted to superstition and barbarous rites, where they considered it a duty to cover their altars with the blood of captives and to consult their deities through human entrails. The Romans, he notes, were initially paralyzed by the scene. Druids in the groves, women dressed in funeral black, running among them with torches, resembling the Furies. The altars, when the Romans finally advanced, were still stained with recent offerings. The Romans weren't squeamish about violence or death. They'd perfected crucifixion and made public execution an art form, but something about what they found in those groves disturbed them enough that they cut down every sacred tree and defiled every altar. Tacitus reports that the Druids believed human sacrifice was necessary to divine the future and to ensure the favor of their gods in warfare. The entrails of victims were read like auguries, their deaths serving as both offering and oracle. The human detail that survives most powerfully. Many of the victims may have gone willingly. Celtic society operated on principles of honor and obligation. To be chosen as a sacrifice to the gods wasn't necessarily seen as punishment, but as fulfilling the highest calling. The care taken with Lindoman's body, the ritual completeness of his death, the sacred substances in his system, suggests he may have been a willing participant in his own sacrifice, understanding his death as service to his community and gods. And as the pattern becomes clear, a troubling question emerges. Was human sacrifice an aberration? A practice of savage primitives who didn't know better? Or was it a universal technology that human societies discovered independently again and again across time and geography? A solution to the fundamental human problem of how to communicate with and influence the divine. The next case suggests the latter, because the practice didn't end with these civilizations. It spread further, lasted longer, and evolved into forms even more disturbing. The steppe wind howls across the grasslands, carrying the smoke from sacred fires toward a horizon that stretches without interruption in every direction. The year is approximately 450 BCE, and somewhere in the vast territory between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, a Scythian king has died. His people are preparing to honor him in the only way they know ensures his power continues into the next world, by sending servants, horses, and captives to accompany him. The Scythians were legendary even in their own time, fierce nomadic warriors whose horseback archery terrorized settled civilizations from Greece to Persia. They left no written records of their own, but others wrote about them with a mixture of fear and fascination. They were the ultimate barbarians in the Greek imagination. They drank from the skulls of their enemies, scalped their victims, and lived entirely on horseback, never building cities or farming. But Herodotus, who traveled the Black Sea coast and spoke with people who had encountered the Scythians, documented their burial practices in Book 4 of his Histories, written around 440 BCE. When a king died, he wasn't buried alone. His death triggered a year-long funeral process that culminated in mass sacrifice. The king's body was first embalmed, gutted, cleaned, filled with aromatic substances, and sealed with wax. Then began a tour of Scythian territories, the corpse carried from tribe to tribe, each group cutting their own flesh, cropping their hair, and slashing their arms in mourning. This continued for 40 days. At the end, the body was transported to the burial ground, a massive kurgan, a burial mound, where it would be interred with staggering wealth. Here's where it gets dark. According to Herodotus, one of the dead king's concubines was selected and strangled. So was his cupbearer, his cook, his groom, his messenger, and his horses, as many as 50 horses in some cases. Then came the captives. 50 young men from enemy tribes, all strangled, were mounted on the strangled horses using an elaborate system of stakes and supports that kept them upright, creating a circle of dead riders around the burial mound. These mounted corpses served as eternal guardians of the dead king. For decades, scholars debated whether Herodotus was exaggerating or reporting secondhand legends. Then Soviet archaeologists began excavating Scythian burial mounds in the 20th century. At the Chertomlik kurgan in Ukraine, excavated in 1863, they found exactly what Herodotus described, a central burial chamber surrounded by the remains of horses and humans, all killed simultaneously. At Pazyryk in the Altai Mountains, permafrost had preserved the contents of Scythian burials in stunning detail. The horses had been ritually killed with blows to the head. Human remains showed evidence of strangulation. The arrangement matched Herodotus's account with eerie precision. But here's what makes this particularly chilling. This wasn't a one-time event, or a practice of a single mad king. The pattern repeats across dozens of excavated kurgans. The Scythians practiced retainer sacrifice systematically for centuries, from roughly the 7th to the 3rd century BCE. The number of victims varied with the importance of the deceased. A minor chief might be buried with 2 or 3 servants, while a great king commanded dozens of deaths. The young men chosen as mounted guardians were typically between 18 and 25 years old, healthy and strong, premium sacrificial material. They were killed by strangulation or having their necks broken, methods that left the body intact for display. Then came the grotesque artistry, stakes driven through the horse's spine and out through its mouth, connecting to a crosspiece that supported the rider's body, creating an illusion of animated life, an undead cavalry standing eternal watch. The human element. These weren't anonymous slaves or nameless prisoners. Some of the sacrificed individuals in later Scythian burials show evidence of having lived lives of relative privilege. They had dental care, good nutrition, and healed injuries that suggested medical attention. They may have been valued servants who lived well until their master's death suddenly transformed their status from privileged attendant to sacrificial victim. The moment of that transition, from serving breakfast to being measured for a funeral stake, must have been absolutely terrifying. And this wasn't just about the king's comfort in the afterlife. This was a statement about power. A chief who could command the deaths of 50 people and 50 horses at his funeral was demonstrating posthumously that his authority had been absolute. The living absorbed that message. The social order was maintained not just through force during life, but through spectacular displays of expendable human capital at death. The practice didn't stop at burials. Herodotus also describes Scythian battlefield rituals, drinking the blood of the first enemy killed, taking scalps as trophies, using enemy skulls as drinking cups. But the burials were different. They weren't about victory or vengeance. They were about cosmic order, ensuring that the dead ruler continued to have status, servants, and protection in whatever realm awaited. And as we'll see, this connection between warfare, power, and human sacrifice wasn't unique to the Scythians. On the other side of the world, in the mountains of South America, another empire was reaching similar conclusions about the divine requirements of kingship. The air at 20,000 feet burns your lungs, but the 13-year-old girl barely notices. She's been on Lidula Ilaco's summit for days, drinking chicha corn beer spiked with drugs that make the world soft and distant. The year is 1500 CE. Her name is lost, but we know more about her than almost any sacrificial victim because freezing temperatures preserved her perfectly. She's been dead for 500 years, revealing the Inca Empire's most disturbing practice, capacocha, systematic child sacrifice to the sun, god Inti. The official story emphasizes Inca administrative brilliance, roads spanning thousands of miles, quipu record-keeping, agricultural innovations feeding millions. They were master builders whose stonework was so precise you can't slide a knife between blocks. But underlying this sophisticated civilization was deliberate child sacrifice during crises, festivals, or commemorating significant events. Spanish chronicler Bernabé Cobo estimated over 1,000 children were sacrificed during Emperor Huayna Capac's reign alone. Children aged 6 to 15 were selected for physical perfection, no scars, no blemishes. They came from conquered provinces as tribute or from families seeking social status. After months of preparation in Cusco, blessed by priests, dressed in fine textiles, fed special diets, they were told they would meet the gods, not that they would die. The final journey took them to mountain peaks closest to Inti. At 110 feet on Mount Lulilako, archaeologists in 1999 found 3 frozen mummies, 2 girls and a boy. Preservation was so complete, their internal organs remained intact, skin looked alive, stomachs contained their last meals. Forensic analysis revealed the process. In months before death, children's diets shifted toward elite foods. Hair showed elevated coca alkaloids and alcohol, increasing dramatically in final weeks. They were ritually intoxicated, kept compliant and dulled to what was happening. La Doncella, the maiden, the older girl, shows evidence of death by head trauma or exposure after being drugged unconscious. She sat in a small summit chamber, surrounded by carefully arranged offerings, pottery, textiles, gold and silver figurines, ocean shells. Her elaborately braided hair and multiple layers of fine textiles showed someone had taken great care. This was an offering to the gods, and it needed to be perfect. Evidence suggests children may have been partially conscious during the final approach. Some walked partway up mountains under their own power. Coca and alcohol created a dreamlike state, but not complete unconsciousness. They may have understood on some level what was about to happen. Spanish chronicler Cristobal de Molina described the ceremonies. They took the children from their parents and brought them to Cusco, and the Inca ordered that they be killed and buried in the most important parts of his kingdom. Parents weren't permitted to mourn. In Inca cosmology, their children had been elevated to divine status, transformed into intermediaries between humanity and gods. Grief was inappropriate. This was an honor. Mountains were sacred, the source of water, the realm where earth met sky. Each sacrifice peak was visible from Cusco or major administrative centers. Sacrifices served multiple purposes: religious devotion, political control, especially in conquered territories, and cosmic maintenance. The Inca believed human sacrifice, particularly of the young and pure, prevented earthquakes, crop failures, and plagues. At Mount Amparo in 1995, Juanita revealed similar patterns. A teenage girl, carefully prepared, drugged, killed with head trauma, then frozen for 5 centuries. DNA analysis showed she wasn't local. She'd been brought from elsewhere as tribute. The haunting detail: these children were chosen for their perfection, celebrated, paraded through the capital, given experiences of luxury and significance most commoners would never know, then killed because that perfection made them the most valuable offering imaginable. Dust hangs above Nineveh, sun blazing on stone walls decorated with exquisitely brutal relief carvings. The year is 645 BCE, and Ashurbanipal, last great Assyrian king, prepares a ceremony demonstrating both piety and power. Prisoners from a recent Elamite campaign kneel before Ashur's temple, their fate decided by priests determining that gods require blood for the next campaign's victory. The Assyrians pioneered siege warfare, psychological terror, and systematic deportation of conquered populations. They built an empire from Egypt to the Persian Gulf. Their kings commissioned elaborate palaces with stone reliefs documenting conquests in unflinching detail. Propaganda, but also valuable historical documents showing violent realities without flinching. Official narratives focus on gods legitimizing royal power. Ashur, the supreme deity, granted kings the mandate to conquer. Temples were centers of administration, learning, and wealth. This is accurate but incomplete without acknowledging the blood flowing through those temples. Assyrian royal inscriptions are remarkably frank about human sacrifice. Ashur-nasir-pal II's Annals, 883-859 BCE, describe prisoners offered to gods after campaigns. I flayed the nobles, as many as had rebelled, and spread their skins out on the piles. I brought their blood as an offering before Ashur and Ishtar. This isn't metaphorical. The inscription continues. Many captives I burned with fire. From some, I cut off their noses, their ears, and their fingers. Of many, I put out their eyes. Not all this violence qualifies as sacrifice. Much was terror warfare designed to break resistance. However, royal inscriptions and palace reliefs document specifically ritual killings, performed in temple contexts for religious purposes. At the New Year festival, Akitu, prisoners were ritually executed during ceremonies renewing the king's divine mandate. Cuneiform tablets describe how prisoners' blood purified sacred spaces and anointed divine statues. This wasn't battlefield slaughter. This was liturgical violence, performed by priests according to protocols, with victims' deaths serving as offerings to gods. Archaeological evidence comes from multiple sources. At Nineveh, temple excavations uncovered drainage systems, specifically designed for large blood quantities from altar areas. Volume and design suggest industrial-scale bloodletting beyond animal sacrifice alone. At Nimrud, reliefs show prisoners being led by priests toward altars, their positions suggesting ritual rather than simple execution. Most disturbing is evidence that Assyrian kings occasionally offered family members. When faced with devastating defeats or disasters interpreted as divine displeasure, royal inscriptions reference the giving of the sun or the pure offering from the palace. Euphemisms scholars interpret as references to prince or princess sacrifice. A 7th century BCE Assyrian prophecy text states, "If the king does not give his son to the god, then his land will be given to the enemy." This creates horrifying calculus: sacrifice your heir or lose your kingdom. Some scholars believe this prophecy was invoked during the empire's chaotic final years, when multiple kings reigned briefly before being overthrown. A Neo-Assyrian letter from royal archives shows a priest reporting on divination rituals to determine why gods are angry. The recommendation: multiple prisoners should be offered to Ishtar, and, if the signs remain unfavorable, consider the pure offering. The clinical tone makes it worse. Bureaucratic correspondence about human sacrifice as an administrative problem requiring proper procedure. Morning mist rises from the sacred grove, and through it, robed figures move with ceremonial precision. The year is 200 BCE, somewhere in Gaul, and druids prepare for Samhain, the harvest season's end and the dark half-year's beginning. This is the night when boundaries between the living world and otherworld grow thin, and gods require acknowledgement of that terrible permeability. They require blood. The Celts weren't a unified empire, but tribes sharing linguistic and cultural roots across Europe, from Ireland to Anatolia. They were skilled metalworkers, fierce warriors, sophisticated traders. Their art, swirling patterns and stylized animals, influenced cultures from Britain to the Black Sea. But they were deeply bound to ritual cycles tied to agricultural seasons and celestial events, particularly the sun's annual journey. The sun wasn't just a celestial body. It was Lugh, Bel, Granus, deities whose favor determined whether crops grew, winter could be survived, whether darkness would give way to light. And those gods demanded sacrifice. Roman sources are consistent about Celtic sacrificial practices. Diodorus Siculus, in 1st century BCE, describes how Celts devote to death a human being and stab him with a dagger in the region above the diaphragm. And when he has fallen, they foretell the future from his fall and from the convulsions of his limbs and from the spurting of his blood. This was divination, reading the future in death's manner. Strabo adds, they used to strike a man whom they had devoted to death in the back with a sword and make prophecies based on his death spasms. Different methods produced different prophecies: the way a victim fell, which direction blood spurted, how long death took, all carried meaning to trained observers. Archaeological evidence comes from multiple sites. At Ribemont-sur-Ancre in southern France, excavators discovered a charnel house sanctuary containing thousands of individuals' remains, mostly young men arranged in specific patterns. Bones showed evidence of defleshing and dismemberment after death, then display on wooden frameworks. Carbon dating places used between 260–50 BCE. At Gournay-sur-Aronde, another French site, excavators found similar patterns. A sacred enclosure containing numerous human and animal remains, with evidence of ritual killing and display. Human victims had been decapitated, skulls displayed separately from bodies. Nearby weapons showed ritual destruction. Bent swords and broken spears, never used in combat, but deliberately damaged and offered to gods. The most direct evidence comes from bog bodies across northern Europe. Old Croghan man, found in Ireland in 2003, had been stabbed in the chest, decapitated, and had his nipples sliced. A specific mutilation mentioned in Irish mythology as rendering a king unfit to rule. He'd been fed milk and cereals in final months, consistent with special preparation. His arms showed defensive wounds. He didn't go willingly. Cloney man, also in Ireland, was struck repeatedly on the head with an axe, then disemboweled. His hair had been dressed with plant oil and pine resin imported from southern Europe, suggesting high status. He'd been prepared for something significant, dressed and groomed for a ceremony ending with his body deposited in a bog. Celtic sacrifice wasn't random violence. It was structured, ritualized, often targeting specific individuals. Irish bog bodies frequently show signs of high status: good nutrition, grooming, lack of manual labor damage. These may have been failed kings or nobles who brought disaster, therefore offered to gods as both appeasement and explanation. Torches flicker in the underground chamber at Eleusis, casting dancing shadows on walls that have witnessed ceremonies for over 1,000 years. The year is 400 BCE, and initiates gather for the greater mysteries. Ancient Greece's most sacred and secretive ritual. What happens here is protected by laws so strict that revealing the mysteries is punishable by death. The secrecy has been largely successful. Even 2,000 years later, we're still not entirely sure what occurred in those underground halls. The official story about Demeter, goddess of the harvest, is relatively benign. Her daughter Persephone was abducted by Hades. In her grief, Demeter withdrew her blessings, causing the first winter. When Persephone was partially returned, spending half the year above and half below, Demeter's joy brought spring and summer, her sorrow brought fall and winter. The myth explains agricultural cycles, and the Eleusinian mysteries celebrated this through rituals promising initiates blessed afterlives. That's the public version you learned in mythology class. But the mysteries were called mysteries for a reason, and penalties for revealing them suggest something more troubling than agricultural metaphor. Aeschylus was nearly executed for allegedly revealing sacred secrets in a play. Alcibiades was prosecuted for profaning the mysteries, contributing to his Athenian exile. The Greeks took this secrecy seriously. What hints survive come from fragmentary references and archaeological evidence. The Telesterion, the great hall at Eleusis where final revelation occurred, could hold thousands. Certain features remained constant through multiple rebuildings. An underground area called the Hades, a chamber where something was revealed in darkness, and drainage systems suggesting liquid offerings. Clement of Alexandria, an early Christian writer eager to discredit pagan religions, claimed in the 2nd century CE that the climax involved revealing an ear of wheat, accompanied by "the mighty mistress has borne a sacred child." If true, it seems anticlimactic, but other sources hint at more disturbing revelations. References in fragmentary papyri suggest ritual included a reenactment of Persephone's abduction and return, not symbolically, but with actual participants. Some scholars interpret these to mean initiation involved experiencing symbolic death and rebirth through ingesting psychoactive substances, the kykeon, a ritual drink possibly containing ergot from barley, followed by witnessing something in the underground chamber while in an altered state. Archaeological work at Eleusis uncovered expected animal sacrifice evidence, but 1930s-1950s excavations revealed something else. Human remains in ritual contexts, carefully buried suggesting offering rather than normal interment. The remains were predominantly young, dating to the early period, roughly 1500–1000 BCE. Ancient sources contain troubling hints about early phases of Demeter worship. Pausanias, 2nd century CE, mentions that in old times, rituals at Eleusis included offerings later replaced with animal sacrifices. He doesn't specify what original offerings were, but his language suggests deliberate vagueness about something disturbing. Porphyry, 3rd century CE philosopher, claims ancient Greeks practiced human sacrifice to Kronos, and these practices transferred to Demeter worship in some contexts. He's writing 6 centuries after the practice theoretically ended, but claims to draw on older sources. The most intriguing evidence comes from mythology itself. The story of Pelops, served as a meal to gods by his father Tantalus, takes place in the context of testing Demeter's awareness. In one version, Demeter, distraught over Persephone's abduction, unknowingly eats part of Pelops' shoulder before other gods realize and revive the boy. Why include this detail? Some scholars suggest it's a fossilized memory of actual sacrificial practices, where human flesh was ritually consumed. The Eleusinian mysteries promised initiates a blessed afterlife, fundamentally different from the bleak underworld described in Homer. What created such certainty? What revelation could guarantee immortality in a culture where afterlife was usually portrayed as endless, gloomy existence? We'll never know. The initiates kept their oaths for over 1,000 years, and when Christianity suppressed the mysteries in the 4th century CE, secrets died with the last priests. Heat radiates off the stone plaza in waves that make distant buildings shimmer. The air smells of incense, myrrh and frankincense imported from Arabia, mixed with something else that makes visitors uncomfortable. Carthage, the greatest Phoenician colony, stands at its power's height in the 4th century BCE. Controlling Mediterranean trade routes, its merchants wealthy beyond imagination, its military feared from Sicily to Libya. But beneath the city's sophisticated veneer, in a sacred precinct called the Tophet, a practice unfolds that will horrify even civilizations familiar with violence. The Phoenicians, the maritime culture that founded Carthage and cities from Cyprus to Spain, practiced these rites across their entire colonial network. This wasn't a Carthaginian aberration. This was core Phoenician religious practice, exported wherever they established settlements. The god at the center was Baal Hammon, identified with Moloch, whose name appears in the Hebrew Bible describing child sacrifice. And they built the high places of Baal, to cause their sons and their daughters to pass through the fire unto Moloch. Jeremiah 32:35. For centuries, scholars debated whether biblical references described actual practices or were polemical exaggerations. The archaeology settled the debate decisively. The Tophet at Carthage contains layer upon layer of burial urns, spanning roughly 600 years. But Carthage wasn't alone. Tophet sites have been excavated at Motia in Sicily, at Tharos and Saltis in Sardinia, at Hadrumetum in Tunisia. The pattern is consistent. Urban areas with substantial Phoenician populations all have these sacred precincts filled with cremated infant remains. Inscriptions on stelae erected above urns follow formulas. To the Lady Tanit and to the Lord Baal Hammon, that which name vowed, because they heard his voice and blessed him. The that which refers to the child in the urn. Some inscriptions specify the offering type, MLK, MR, substitute lamb, or MLK DM, blood offering. But isotopic analysis confirms these are human children, not animals. The most comprehensive study of the Carthage Tophet, published in 2010 after analyzing hundreds of urns, found that the majority of remains were infants under 3 months old, with significant numbers being newborns or fetuses. Some researchers proposed the Tophet was simply an infant cemetery. Infant mortality was high. But this doesn't explain inscriptions explicitly describing them as offerings, nor why other Phoenician cemeteries exist separately. Classical sources are unambiguous about sacrificial practice. Diodorus Siculus describes a 310 BCE crisis when besieged Carthage had a bronze image of Cronus, Baal Hammon, extending its hands, palms up, and sloping toward the ground, so that each of the children, when placed thereon, rolled down and fell into a sort of gaping pit filled with fire. He continues, the Carthaginians believed that the gods had become angry with them, because they had been offering up purchased children rather than their own. Plutarch adds details about the soundscape. The whole area before the statue was filled with a loud noise of flutes and drums, so that the cries of wailing should not reach the ears of the people. The intention was clear: drown out screams so observers wouldn't lose nerve. What makes the Phoenician case particularly complex? The practice appears deeply integrated into their social and economic system. The wealthiest families made the largest offerings, commemorated with the most elaborate stelae. This wasn't desperate peasants sacrificing during famines. This was elite families demonstrating piety, fulfilling vows, maintaining social status through ritual generosity. Children offered were often from the best families, not unwanted infants or slaves. Some inscriptions include phrases suggesting gratitude. Gods heard a prayer, blessed a family with prosperity, protected a ship at sea. The child sacrifice was payment, a transaction. Success proved the gods were pleased. The practice ended when Rome destroyed Carthage in 146 BCE, not from Roman moral superiority. Romans practiced human sacrifice in their own early history and continued gladiatorial games serving similar social functions. It ended because Carthage ended, its population killed or enslaved, its buildings torn down, its fields sown with salt. The forest is silent except for crackling fire and rhythmic chanting rising from the clearing ahead. Snow covers ground, muffling footsteps, but you can see your breath. The year is 950 CE, somewhere in Norway or Sweden, and ahead, figures move in firelight, men wearing bear and wolf skins, faces twisted in expressions that seem barely human. These are berserkers, Ulfhednar, the most feared warriors in Norse society. Tonight they prepare to make an offering to Odin, the All-Father, god of war and death, who demands blood to grant victory. The popular Viking image has been sanitized by centuries of romantic myth-making. We think of explorers and traders, skilled navigators who reached North America centuries before Columbus, poets who composed elaborate sagas. All true. But the Norse were also practitioners of religious violence that shocked even medieval Christians familiar with crusades and inquisitions. Berserkers were a warrior cult dedicated specifically to Odin. Old Norse sagas describe them entering Berserk's Gangr, a trance-like fury where they became immune to pain, fought with supernatural strength, and sometimes couldn't distinguish friend from foe. Modern scholars debate whether this was purely psychological, involved drugs like henbane or fly agaric mushrooms, or represented controlled psychosis. Whatever the mechanism, berserkers were real, documented in multiple independent sources. But berserkers weren't just fierce fighters. They were priests of violence, and their devotion to Odin required sacrificial offerings. The Ynglinga saga, written by Snorri Sturluson in the 13th century, but based on much older skaldic poetry, describes how Odin established sacrifice customs. But the Heimskringla is more explicit. At this feast, all were to take part in the drinking. Also, all kinds of livestock were killed in connection with it, also horses. All the blood from them was called hlaut, sacrificial blood. With them were to be smeared all over with blood, the pedestals of the idols, and also the walls of the temple within and without. And likewise the men present were to be sprinkled with blood. But whose blood? Adam of Bremen, writing in the 1070s about the great temple at Uppsala in Sweden, provides disturbing details. The sacrifice is of this nature. Of every living thing that is male, they offer 9 heads, with the blood of which it is customary to placate gods of this sort. The bodies they hang in the sacred grove that adjoins the temple. Now, this grove is so sacred in the eyes of the heathen that each and every tree in it is believed divine because of the death or putrefaction of the victims. Even dogs and horses hang there with men. 9 of every male creature, including humans. Adam describes bodies hanging from trees in Uppsala's sacred grove, visible to anyone approaching. This wasn't hidden violence, it was public devotion. 9 was sacred to Odin, who hung himself from Yggdrasil for 9 days to gain rune knowledge. The sacrifices mimicked this mythological act. Archaeological evidence supports these accounts. At Tisu in Denmark, excavations uncovered a site with evidence of large-scale feasting and sacrificial activity. Among animal bones were human remains showing signs of hanging and ritual deposition. At Trelleborg in Sweden, mass graves show patterns consistent with sacrificial killing rather than battle casualties. Bodies carefully arranged, killed by similar methods, deposited in ritual contexts. The most chilling evidence comes from berserkers themselves. The Vatnsdæla saga describes how berserkers would challenge local champions to holmgang, ritual duels, and when they won, often given their training and frenzy, they would claim the loser's property and sometimes wives. Some sagas suggest defeated holmgang opponents were sacrificed to Odin, their deaths serving dual purposes: personal gain for the victor and religious offering to the war god. Victims were selected from multiple sources. Prisoners of war were obvious choices. Sagas are filled with accounts of captured enemies hanged from trees or sacrificed on altars. But some sources suggest criminals, slaves, and even volunteers might be offered. Gottrek's saga includes a disturbing account of an elderly couple who throw themselves off a cliff onto rocks as sacrifice to Odin, believing this will guarantee them Valhalla. The saga treats this as admirable devotion rather than tragedy. The practice didn't end cleanly with Christianization. In remote Scandinavian areas, syncretic practices continued for centuries. Archaeological evidence from Iceland shows that even after official conversion to Christianity in 1000, some communities continued traditional sacrificial practices in secret. The pyramid rises from jungle like a stone mountain, stairs climbing toward a sky where vultures circle. The year is 800 CE, somewhere in the Maya world. Perhaps Chichen Itza, perhaps Tikal. At the pyramid's top, priests prepare a ceremony honoring Kukulkan, the feathered serpent, the Maya name for the deity the Aztecs would later call Quetzalcoatl, god of wind, the morning star, bringer of knowledge and civilization, and, like so many gods, a deity requiring blood. The official narrative about Quetzalcoatl portrays him as the civilizing force in Mesoamerican mythology, the god who gave humans maize, who taught writing and astronomy, who opposed human sacrifice in some myth versions, and went into self-imposed exile rather than continue it. This version, promoted by some Spanish chroniclers who saw Quetzalcoatl as possible indigenous prefiguration of Christianity, emphasizes beneficence and wisdom, The actual evidence paints a more complex picture. While some late Aztec sources describe Quetzalcoatl as opposing sacrifice, earlier Maya inscriptions and iconography show the feathered serpent deity intimately connected with bloodletting and sacrificial rituals. At Chichen Itza, the Temple of the Warriors features columns carved with the feathered serpent, intertwined with human sacrifice scenes. The reliefs are explicit, captives being prepared for sacrifice, hearts being removed, skulls displayed on racks. These aren't later additions, they're original to 10th–11th century CE construction. The murals in the upper temple of the Jaguars show massive battle scenes culminating in prisoner sacrifice before a feathered serpent deity. Detail is remarkable. You can see expressions on captives' faces, ceremonial regalia of priests, obsidian blades catching light. This was public art, meant to be seen and understood. The most direct evidence comes from the cenote, the sacred well at Chichen Itza. When dredged in the early 20th century, remains of more than 40 individuals were recovered, along with jade, gold, pottery, and incense. Some remains showed trauma consistent with sacrifice. Others appear to have drowned. Spanish Bishop Diego de Landa, writing in the 1560s, described how victims were thrown into the cenote at dawn during droughts, with the promise that if they survived until midday, they would be pulled out and report what gods had said. Most didn't survive. The Maya codices, the handful of folding books surviving Spanish book burnings, contain almanacs for timing sacrificial rituals to Kukulkan. The Dresden Codex includes tables correlating Venus movements associated with Quetzalcoatl, Kukulkan, with auspicious times for bloodletting and sacrifice. This wasn't occasional practice. It was systematized, integrated into the calendar system governing all aspects of Maya life. At Cacaxtla, a site in central Mexico, murals from around 650 to 700 CE show figures dressed as bird warriors, possibly representing Quetzalcoatl cultists engaged in combat and sacrifice. One striking image shows a figure dressed as a bird, ripping open a prostrate warrior's abdomen, while blood and intestines spill out. Feathered serpent imagery frames the entire scene. But the Quetzalcoatl cult gets genuinely strange. The mythology includes stories of Quetzalcoatl himself performing auto-sacrifice. In the myth of the fifth sun's creation, the current world in Aztec cosmology, gods must sacrifice themselves to set the sun in motion. Quetzalcoatl, along with other deities, sheds his own blood to create humanity, and later performs penance by piercing himself with thorns and offering blood to sustain the gods who sacrifice themselves. This creates a theological loop. Gods sacrifice themselves to create and sustain the world, so humans must sacrifice themselves to sustain gods, so gods can continue sustaining the world. Everyone is both victim and perpetrator in an endless cycle of necessary violence. It's a remarkably dark cosmology, making sacrifice not just acceptable, but mandatory, not just religious devotion, but cosmic maintenance. The human element emerges in descriptions of victim preparation. The Florentine Codex describes how captives chosen for sacrifice to Quetzalcoatl were dressed in the god's regalia, feathered costumes, turquoise jewelry, shell ornaments. They were treated as the god's representatives, even worshipped before death. Some accounts suggest they were given hallucinogens to help them embody the deity more fully. One haunting detail: at some ceremonies, the victim would dance at the pyramid's top before sacrifice. The crowd watching from below would see not a human prisoner, but the god himself, dancing above them before returning to the divine realm through sacrifice's portal. The priest performing the killing wasn't committing murder. He was facilitating the god's return home. Torchlight flickers against damp stone walls as you descend narrow stairs into the Mithraeum, the underground temple. The year is 200 CE, somewhere in the Roman Empire, perhaps Rome itself, perhaps London, perhaps a frontier military post where Mithraism flourished among soldiers. The air is thick with incense and wine scent. Ahead, carved into stone at the chamber's end, you see the central image, Mithras, a young god in Persian clothing, slaying a bull while various animals watch: a dog, snake, scorpion, raven. This is the tauroctony, the defining image of Rome's most mysterious cult. The official story about Mithraism emphasizes its popularity among Roman soldiers. all-male membership, elaborate initiation rituals involving 7 advancement levels, and eventual suppression by Christianity. Modern scholars often present Mithraism as relatively benign, a masculine mystery cult focused on the cosmic symbolism, moral behavior, and communal bonding. The bull in the central image, we're told, is probably a symbolic representation of astronomical phenomena, and the killing is metaphorical. But the underground temples, secrecy, blood imagery, and fragmentary evidence suggest something darker lurking beneath astronomy metaphors. Mithraism left almost no written texts. Unlike other Roman mystery cults, Mithraic believers maintained secrecy oaths so effectively that almost nothing survives explaining what initiates experienced or believed. What we have are archaeological remains of Mithraea, iconography carved into walls, and hostile accounts from early Christians who viewed the cult as demonic Christianity parody. The Mithraea themselves are revealing. They're always underground or made to appear underground. Windowless chambers designed to create complete darkness, with long benches along walls where initiates would recline during ceremonies. At the far end, the tauroctony dominates, often flanked by scenes of Mithras's birth, from rock and ascension in a chariot. The spaces are small, typically holding no more than 20 to 40 people, creating intimate, claustrophobic atmosphere. What archaeologists have found in these spaces raises questions. At the Mithraeum under the Church of San Clemente in Rome, excavations revealed drainage channels and pits that seem over-engineered for simple libation offerings or animal sacrifice. The channels could have handled large liquid volumes. At the Walbrook Mithraeum in London, recovered artifacts include numerous knives and a bull skull, but also evidence of extensive bloodletting, exceeding what animal sacrifice alone would produce. Initiation rituals are described in fragmentary, frustrating detail by Christian critics. Tertullian, writing around 200 CE, mentions that Mithric initiates undergo baptism for sin remission and marks on the forehead, creating deliberate parallel, or, in his view, demonic mockery of Christian practices. But he also mentions the highest initiation level involves ritual where the candidate is bound and threatened with death, then resurrected by the cult leader. More disturbingly, Christian writer Porphyry claims that during initiations, candidates would be tested through ordeal, perhaps involving actual wounds or bloodletting, to prove courage and devotion. The fragmentary Mithras liturgy, a text that may or may not represent actual Mithraic practice, includes instructions for ritual involving invocation of divine names while in a state of physical stress or pain. The 7 initiation levels, Corax, Raven, Nymphis, Male Bride, Miles, Soldier, Leo, Lion, Perses, Persian, Heliodromus, Sunrunner, and Potter, Father. Each involve specific ordeals and revelations. Graffiti and inscriptions in Mithraea reference these levels with symbols including weapons, crowns, and implements of sacrifice. The Miles level particularly seems to have involved a test of martial courage that may have included wounding. The most controversial theory concerns the bull sacrifice itself. Some scholars propose the central tauroctony scene wasn't purely symbolic, that actual bull sacrifices were performed in Mithraea, with blood collected in pits beneath the floor and meat consumed in communal meals. Evidence from some Mithraea shows cattle bone remains and chemical analysis of soil samples revealing high concentrations of blood and fat. The more disturbing possibility, suggested by fragmentary references and extreme secrecy, is that human bloodletting, possibly including sacrificial death in extreme circumstances, was part of the highest initiation levels. This theory is highly controversial and rejected by many scholars, but based on several pieces of circumstantial evidence, over-engineered drainage systems, Christian accusations going beyond typical demonization rhetoric, extraordinary secrecy maintained by the cult, and parallels with other mystery religions where initiation involved experiencing symbolic or actual death. Mithraism was overwhelmingly popular among soldiers, particularly those stationed on frontiers. These were men intimately familiar with violence, blood, and death. A cult promising cosmic significance, secret knowledge, and connection with a warrior god would naturally appeal. Would such men be satisfied with purely symbolic rituals? When Christianity triumphed in the 4th century, Mithraism didn't fade away. It was actively suppressed, temples deliberately filled with rubble or converted into churches. The speed and thoroughness suggest early Christians saw Mithraism as particularly threatening. Perhaps they knew something about actual practices that the archaeological record only hints at. The darkness in the tomb is absolute, the kind that makes you question whether your eyes are open or closed. The air is stale, thick with natron and myrrh scent, with underlying sweetness speaking of decay despite embalmers' best efforts. The year is 1350 BCE during Egypt's New Kingdom, and you're in a secret chamber beneath the Valley of the Kings, a place that isn't supposed to exist, where priests of Anubis perform rituals that never appear in public temple reliefs or official religious texts. The official story about Anubis is well established. He's the jackal-headed god of mummification and the dead, the guide who leads souls through the underworld, the protector who weighs hearts against Maat's feather to judge the deceased's worthiness for eternal life. He's a psychopomp, guardian, liminal figure standing between life and death. The image of Anubis bending over a mummy, preparing it for eternity, is one of Egyptian iconography's most iconic images. But the archaeological record and fragmentary papyri suggest Anubis worship included darker elements, particularly in the cult's inner circles, where the boundary between preserving the dead and creating them became uncomfortably blurred. The Egyptian obsession with death and afterlife is well documented, but what's less discussed is that maintaining this system, the elaborate funerary industry, massive tomb construction projects, endless mummifications, required a steady supply of both corpses and knowledge of how to process them. And some knowledge could only come from hands-on experience with the newly dead. Herodotus, visiting Egypt around 450 BCE, describes embalmers with fascination and revulsion. The most perfect process is as follows. As much as possible of the brain is extracted through the nostrils with an iron hook, and what the hook cannot reach is rinsed out with drugs. Next, the flank is opened with a flint knife, and the whole contents of the abdomen removed. He continues with clinical detail about organ removal and preservation, treatment of the body cavity, and the wrapping process. But he adds a disturbing note. When they have been thus prepared, the embalmers, having washed the corpse, wrap it up in bandages. Relatives come and fetch the corpse. The phrasing suggests a transaction. Relatives retrieve what embalmers have finished with. But what happens during preparation, when the body belongs entirely to the embalmers, to Anubis's priests? Some papyri contain fragments scholars have long found troubling. The Book of the Dead includes spells that reference passing through the house of Anubis in ways suggesting physical locations rather than metaphorical journey. Archaeological excavations have uncovered structures, embalming workshops, with features exceeding what mummification alone would require, drainage systems handling large liquid volumes, storage areas for bodies in various preparation stages, and underground chambers whose purpose remains unclear. At Saqqara, 1970s excavations uncovered a necropolis associated with Anubis worship, containing not just animal mummies, millions, ibises, dogs, cats, all mummified and offered to the god, but also human remains in contexts suggesting ritual rather than normal burial. Some bodies showed evidence of having been mummified while alive, their positions suggesting struggle, their lungs containing natron, preservation beginning before biological death. The evidence is fragmentary and controversial, but some scholars propose the Anubis cult included rituals where the dying, perhaps volunteers, perhaps criminals, perhaps enemies of the state, were initiated into death through accelerated mummification processes. The theological logic, by experiencing afterlife preparation while still possessing consciousness, the initiate could carry direct knowledge into the next world. They would become, literally, living mummies, bridges between the living and dead. Papyrus fragments reference those who serve at the threshold, individuals who undergo partial mummification while alive as preparation for priestly service. Details are sparse, deliberately obscured, but suggest practices modern readers find deeply disturbing. Deliberate desiccation of living tissue, removal of organs from living bodies, possibly with drugs to manage pain and awareness, wrapping of bodies that still breathed. The human element emerges in inscriptions left by embalmers, graffiti in tombs, and workshops where workers recorded their presence. Some inscriptions include prayers to Anubis that reference preparing the living for the crossings and making pure the willing sacrifice. The language is ambiguous but suggests practices beyond standard mummification. One particularly disturbing text, the Anubis liturgy preserved fragmentarily at the Brooklyn Museum, describes a ritual where a priest opens the way for the volunteer, preparing the vessels while the heart still beats, making smooth the path through preservation of the flesh before the spirit departs. Academic debate about this text is fierce. Some argue it's purely metaphorical. Others suggest it describes animal mummification observed by living humans, and a minority propose it documents actual human sacrifice disguised as voluntary initiation. What makes the Anubis case particularly difficult? Ancient Egypt had no clear ethical prohibition against using human bodies for religious purposes. Pharaohs themselves were ritually murdered through the opening of the mouth ceremony, symbolically killed to be reborn as gods. Retainer sacrifice occurred in the earliest dynasties. The line between honoring the dead and creating them was, in Egyptian thought, potentially more permeable than modern ethics would allow. The cult of Anubis declined as Egypt came under foreign control, first Persian, then Greek, then Roman. The last known temple dedicated primarily to Anubis was closed by Christian authorities in the 5th century CE. The buildings were repurposed, statues destroyed, and whatever secrets Anubis's priests had maintained for 3,000 years died with them. The screaming can be heard from outside the villa, even through thick walls, even over drums and flutes played at frantic tempo. The year is 186 BCE, and Roman authorities are raiding a secret bacchanalia, a festival dedicated to Bacchus, god of wine, ecstasy, and liberation. What they find inside will shock Rome so profoundly that the Senate will pass emergency legislation attempting to ban these festivals throughout Italy. The discovery will confirm suspicions that Bacchus worship has evolved from celebratory drinking into something far darker. The official story about Bacchus, the Roman version of Greek Dionysus, portrays him as the god of wine and revelry, patron of theater and fertility, a deity who brings joy and liberation from daily life's constraints. His festivals involve drinking, dancing, theatrical performances, all relatively harmless. But the Bacchanalian scandal of 186 BCE reveals some worshippers had taken the god's promise of liberation to its logical extreme. Liberation from all social constraints, all moral restrictions, all laws. What began as drunken celebration evolved into secret societies where criminal conspiracy, sexual violence, and human sacrifice occurred under the guise of religious ecstasy. The primary source is Livy, the Roman historian writing about 2 centuries after events, but drawing on earlier sources including the senatorial decree that attempted to suppress the cult. According to Livy's account, young Roman Abutius was introduced to the Bacchic mysteries by his mother and stepfather, who planned to use initiation to corrupt or eliminate him and access his inheritance. Abutius's freedwoman lover, Hispala Phaetinia, herself a former Bacchic initiate, warned him about what actually occurred at these festivals. Hispala's testimony to the consuls is recorded by Livy in disturbing detail. At first, she said, it was a ritual for women, and it was the custom that no man should be admitted to it. Bacula Annia, a Campanian when she was priestess, had made changes in all these practices, as if at the bidding of the gods, for she was the first to initiate men. When wine, darkness, the mingling of males with females, young with old, had destroyed all moral judgment, all kinds of corruption began to be practiced. She continues, there were more lustful practices among men with one another than among women. If any of them were disinclined to submit to abuse or reluctant to commit crime, they were sacrificed as victims. To consider nothing wrong was the highest form of religious devotion among them. Men, as though insane, would utter prophecies with frenzied bodily convulsions. Married women in the dress of bacchantes, with disheveled hair and carrying blazing torches, would run down to the Tiber. The most shocking claim? Those who revealed their secrets or were reluctant to commit crimes or submit to abuse were dispatched as sacrificial victims. Their number was very great, almost constituting a second people. The Roman response was swift and brutal. the Senate passed the Senatus Consultum de Bacchanalibus, one of the few ancient Roman legislative documents surviving an original bronze inscription. It strictly regulated Bacchic worship. No more than 5 people could gather for Bacchic rites. No permanent priesthood was allowed. No common treasury could be maintained, and any violation was punishable by death. The crackdown was severe. Livy claims more than 7,000 people were implicated, with many executed and others imprisoned. Whether these numbers are accurate or inflated by moral panic is debated, but the bronze inscription proves the Senate took the threat seriously enough to create permanent legislation. Here's where historical analysis becomes complex. Was this an actual cult practicing human sacrifice, or moral panic amplified by political motives? Some scholars argue the Bacchanalian scandal was more about controlling women and lower-class religious autonomy than actual criminal activity. The fact that the cult had evolved to include women as leaders and allowed mixing of social classes made it threatening to Roman patriarchal authority, regardless of what actually occurred. However, the specificity of accusations and archaeological evidence suggests something real underlying the panic. Excavations at villas associated with Bacchic worship have uncovered remains difficult to explain through legitimate religious practice alone. Underground chambers with restraint implements, extensive drainage systems, and, in some cases, human remains showing evidence of violent death in ritual contexts. At Pompeii, the famous Villa of the Mysteries contains frescoes depicting Bacchic initiation rites. One panel shows a woman being whipped, while others watch, interpreted by most scholars as depicting flagellation as part of initiation. Another panel shows naked figures in apparent states of ecstasy or trance. A third shows a woman cowering in terror, while a winged figure approaches with raised wings. These aren't depictions of gentle wine-drinking parties. They're images of ordeal, pain, and fear in religious contexts. The human detail making this case disturbing. Unlike many other cults examined, Bacchanalian practices occurred within Roman society itself, among Roman citizens, in the heart of what was becoming the world's dominant empire. This wasn't primitive savages in distant lands. These were educated, wealthy Romans, including senators' wives and daughters, who apparently believed true worship of Bacchus required transgression, that the only way to achieve the liberation the god promised was to break every social law and moral prohibition. The Bacchanalian cult was suppressed but not eliminated. Bacchic worship continued in modified forms throughout the Roman Empire, and Dionysian mystery cults flourished in Greece and Asia Minor for centuries. But after 186 BCE, they did so under strict regulation and with understanding that excess would be met with state violence. The ziggurat rises from the desert like a man-made mountain, its mud brick walls baked hard by Mesopotamian sun. The year is 2600 BCE in the city of Ur, one of the world's oldest cities, and today the queen has died. But she won't make the journey to the underworld alone. Dozens of courtiers, servants, and musicians are preparing to accompany her, dressed in their finest clothes, carrying objects they'll need in the afterlife. They know where this procession ends. They're walking willingly toward their own deaths. The Sumerians didn't just invent writing, they invented civilization itself. Cuneiform script, the first writing system, the first cities, the first laws, the first literature, including the Epic of Gilgamesh, humanity's first great meditation on mortality and the search for immortality. The Sumerians gave us the wheel, sailboat, plow. They were sophisticated, urban, literate, and they buried their dead royalty with mass human sacrifice on a scale that still shocks archaeologists nearly a century after its discovery. The evidence comes from the Royal Cemetery of Ur, excavated by Leonard Woolley between 1922 and 1934. What Woolley found in those ancient tombs rewrote understanding of Sumerian culture. The tomb, designated PG 789, identified as belonging to Queen Puabi, contained not just the queen's body, adorned with an elaborate headdress of gold leaves and lapis lazuli, but the remains of 10 women and 5 men, all richly dressed, all carefully arranged in specific positions around the burial chamber. But that was just the inner chamber. In the approach ramp leading to the tomb, the death pit, Woolley found remains of 68 more people, 4 grooms with 2 oxen each, 6 soldiers with copper spears, 28 women wearing elaborate headdresses, musicians holding their instruments, and assorted attendants. They were all killed simultaneously, poisoned most likely, based on small cups found near their bodies, and the absence of trauma to skeletons. PG 1237, the Great Death Pit, contains 74 bodies, 6 men and 68 women, all lying in neat rows. The women wore headdresses of gold, lapis, and carnelian. Their positions suggested they had arranged themselves carefully before drinking poison, lying down on their sides, tucking their hands under their heads like children going to sleep. The archaeological evidence tells a story. The sacrifice victims weren't killed elsewhere and dragged to the tomb. They walked in alive. They descended the ramp into the pit, carrying the objects they would need, wearing their ceremonial clothes. They arranged themselves in prescribed positions, musicians in one area, soldiers in another, women in precise rows. Then they drank from cups containing poison. As they died, other attendants remained conscious long enough to position the last bodies properly, to ensure the lyre players' hands were on their instruments, to verify that everyone was in their assigned place. Then they too drank and died. Woolley wrote in his excavation reports, "The sight of the death pit astonished us. At one end was a great copper cauldron. Against the end wall lay the bodies of 9 women wearing the gala headdress. They were arranged in 2 rows, those in front sitting, those behind them apparently having stood. The whole space between them and the wagons was occupied by women's bodies lying side by side. So far as we could judge, they had disposed themselves in their places and had been left to die alone. This wasn't murder. This was voluntary death. The question is, why?" Sumerian religious texts provide some context. The civilization was obsessed with the underworld, the Kur, a gloomy realm where the dead existed as pale shadows of their living selves. But royalty was different. Kings and queens were semi-divine, and when they died, they became full gods in the underworld, requiring the same service and attendance they had enjoyed in life. Tablet texts describe the death journey of gods and kings, the retinue required to maintain status in the afterlife. A queen couldn't arrive in the underworld alone. That would be shameful, a loss of status. She needed her court, musicians to entertain her, servants to attend her, soldiers to protect her. These weren't optional luxuries. They were requirements of divine dignity. For the attendants, death with the queen was likely seen as the highest honor. They would continue their service in the afterlife, their own status elevated by proximity to the divine. Some may have volunteered, others may have been honored with selection. The line between volunteering and coercion is blurry in societies where refusing an honor from the divine ruler might be unthinkable. The human detail that survives, these weren't generic slaves or nameless prisoners. Analysis of skeletons shows they were well-fed, healthy, showed no signs of hard labor or abuse. These were privileged individuals, members of the palace staff who had lived well. The elaborate headdresses they wore, each one unique, each one valuable, had been crafted specifically for this ceremony. Time and wealth had been invested in their deaths. The practice of retainer burial ended after the early dynastic Thrid period, around 2450 BCE. Later, Sumerian rulers were buried alone or with token offerings rather than human attendants. What changed? Perhaps economic factors. Mass sacrifice was expensive. Perhaps religious evolution. New theologies about the afterlife. Perhaps social resistance, even in hierarchical societies. Losing dozens of skilled workers every time a ruler died creates practical problems. But for several centuries, in the world's first civilization, human sacrifice on a massive scale was normal. It was expected. It was how things were done. The drums began at dawn, their rhythm carrying across Abomi's walls, capital of the kingdom of Dahomey. The year is 1780, and King Kapengla has died. His successor has been chosen, but before the new king can take power, the old king's status in the afterlife must be secured. That means blood, a great deal of blood. The annual customs, the ceremony that will both commemorate the dead king and empower the living one, will claim hundreds of lives before it ends. The official narrative about Dahomey, when discussed at all in Western education, tends to focus on the Dahomey Amazons, the elite all-female military units that fascinated European visitors. The kingdom's sophisticated administrative system, its wealth from the palm oil trade, its military innovations. These were real achievements, but Dahomey was also one of the last pre-colonial African kingdoms to practice large-scale human sacrifice, continuing the practice well into the 19th century, long after most of the world had abandoned such rituals, and the scale was staggering. Not dozens but hundreds of victims in a single ceremony, killed over several days in elaborate public spectacles. The evidence comes from multiple European sources, merchants, missionaries, and eventually colonial administrators who witnessed the annual customs firsthand and recorded what they saw with varying degrees of horror and fascination. Their accounts are remarkably consistent across different observers and decades, suggesting they're not exaggerating or fabricating. Robert Norris, an English slave trader who visited Dahomey in 1772, described the annual customs in detail. The grand customs, celebrated in honor of the deceased kings, continue 41 days, during which time there is continual feasting, drinking, and merrymaking. The king's wealth is displayed, and human victims, varying from 20 to 500, are sacrificed on different occasions during the festival. Frederick Forbes, a British naval officer who visited Abomey in 1850, provided even more specific accounts. At Cana, Abomey, the capital, public decapitations take place continuously. The victims include war captives, criminals, and in some cases purchased slaves. The bodies are thrown over the palace walls, and the heads are displayed on racks as offerings to the royal ancestors. French explorer Jean Bayol, visiting in 1889 near the end of independent Dahomey, described a ceremony where 23 victims were sacrificed in a single afternoon, with the king explaining that each victim carried messages to deceased kings in the afterlife. Some victims' bodies were dismembered, with parts being buried in different locations to consecrate those sites. The most detailed account comes from Edouard Foa, who witnessed the 1891 ceremonies. The victims were brought forward in groups, some were beheaded immediately. Others underwent various tortures designed to show their courage and that of the Dahomeyan people. The king himself participated, not in the killing, but in selecting victims and determining methods. The atmosphere was festive. Musicians played, women danced, rum flowed freely. Death was celebration, sacrifice was entertainment. Victims came from several sources. War captives, especially from enemy kingdoms, were preferred. They were considered gifts to the ancestors who could also humiliate defeated enemies in the afterlife. Criminals condemned to death might be held for months until the next ceremony. Their execution transformed from punishment into religious offering, and in some cases, slaves purchased specifically for sacrifice, particularly when required numbers exceeded available captives. The Dahomey religious logic centered on ancestor worship and the belief that dead kings continued to rule from the afterlife, requiring service and attention. Each year's annual customs both honored the ancestors and reinforced the living king's connection to them. The more elaborate the ceremony, the more victims sacrificed, the stronger that connection became. But the ceremony served political purposes too. The public display of violence demonstrated the king's power. The ability to command hundreds of deaths without resistance proved social control. Foreign observers were deliberately invited to witness these ceremonies, psychological warfare designed to impress and intimidate potential enemies. The Dahomey Amazons, the female soldiers, participated in ceremonies as guards and, occasionally, as executioners. European accounts describe women soldiers conducting some beheadings, their participation emphasizing that this wasn't gendered violence, but state-sanctioned religious obligation transcending gender roles. The human detail emerging from eyewitness accounts. The victims weren't uniformly terrified. Some captives, according to multiple observers, sang songs mocking their captors as they awaited death. Others maintained stoic dignity. A few reportedly volunteered when offered the choice between slavery and sacrificial death, choosing what they saw as honorable death over servile life. The practice began declining in the late 19th century under French colonial pressure. The French, despite their own considerable history of violence, found the annual customs barbaric and used them as justification for conquest. King Béhanzin, who ruled from 1889 to 1894, tried to negotiate, offering to reduce the number of sacrifices in exchange for independence. The French refused compromise, demanding complete cessation. After France defeated Dahomey in 1894 and established colonial control, the annual customs were banned. The last large-scale human sacrifice ceremony occurred in 1893, with later ceremonies using animal sacrifices instead. What makes the Dahomey case particularly significant? This practice continued well into the modern era, contemporary with the Industrial Revolution, photography, telegraphs, steamships. This wasn't ancient history lost in the mists of time. People alive in 2025 have grandparents who were alive when these ceremonies occurred. We've already discussed Capacocha, the Inca practice of sacrificing perfect children to the sun god, but that was just one form of sacrifice among many. The Inca Empire, at its height spanning more than 2,500 miles from Ecuador to Chile, had a complex system of human offerings that went far beyond the mountain peak sacrifices that have captured modern imagination. The year is 1530, just before the Spanish conquest that will shatter the Inca world. At Vilcabamba, one of the most important ceremonial centers, preparations are underway for the Inti Raymi, the Festival of the Sun. This annual celebration marks the winter solstice, the shortest day of the year, when the sun is at its weakest and most needs human aid to regain strength for the coming year. The offerings required aren't optional. They're cosmic maintenance, as essential as breathing. Spanish chronicler Cristobal de Molina, who arrived in Peru shortly after conquest and interviewed Inca elders while memories were still fresh, describes the Inti Raymi in detail. In this month, they also sacrificed a great number of children from the age of 4 to 10 years. They strangled them and buried them with silver and gold figurines. This sacrifice was called Capacocha. But there were other sacrifices also. He continues, they sacrificed llamas of all colors. At all the huacas, sacred sites, they offered coca leaves and other things. And at the huacas where they needed to sacrifice children, they did so. Every province brought children to sacrifice for this festival. The scale of Inca sacrifice is staggering when you aggregate the archaeological and historical evidence. The empire contained approximately 40,000 administrative sites, from major cities to small outposts. Most had local huacas, sacred sites requiring periodic offerings. Major religious festivals occurred monthly. Life cycle events for the emperor and royal family required commemorative sacrifices. Military campaigns were blessed with offerings. Building projects were dedicated with blood. Archaeological surveys have identified more than 180 high-altitude burial sites containing evidence of Capacocha sacrifices, and that's just what survives in the visible archaeological record. Countless others have been destroyed by grave robbers, or haven't yet been discovered. But beyond children, the Inca sacrificed adults too, particularly in times of crisis or at the emperor's death. When Emperor Huayna Capac died in 1527, possibly from smallpox introduced by Spanish contact, though the Spanish themselves hadn't yet reached Cusco, Spanish chronicler Pedro Cieza de León reports that more than 4,000 people were sacrificed during funeral ceremonies, the emperor's wives, servants, and officials who had served him in life. The mechanics of these sacrifices varied. Some victims were strangled with braided cords, others had their throats cut. Some were sacrificed with a blow to the head. The very elite might be given chicha beer, mixed, with drugs to make death easier. Lower status victims might receive no such consideration. Archaeological evidence from graves at Puruchuco, near Lima, shows mass burials from the Inca period containing individuals who died simultaneously, carefully arranged in specific patterns, accompanied by offerings. These weren't battle casualties. They're ceremonial deaths. What makes the Inca case particularly complex? The theology was sophisticated and internally consistent. The Inca believed in a reciprocal relationship with the divine called Aini, sacred reciprocity. The gods gave humans life, food, water, sun, fertile land. Humans were obligated to give back. The most valuable gift humans possessed was human life itself. Therefore, offering human life was the ultimate expression of Aini, maintaining cosmic balance. This wasn't savage barbarity. This was logical theology. If you accept the premises that gods require payment for their gifts, that the universe operates on reciprocal exchange, that human life is the highest value, Then human sacrifice becomes not just acceptable, but necessary, even beautiful. The Spanish, of course, were horrified. But notice the irony. The Spanish criticized Inca human sacrifice while themselves burning heretics alive in the Inquisition, while enslaving millions of indigenous people in mines and plantations where death rates sometimes exceeded 90%, while conducting wars of conquest that killed untold thousands. The difference wasn't that the Spanish valued human life more. The difference was whose deaths they considered necessary and for what purposes. The human detail from Inca sacrifice. Chroniclers report that some victims went willingly, even enthusiastically, believing they were being elevated to divinity. Others resisted. Some families hid their children when the Capacocha selectors came through villages. Others proudly presented their finest children, knowing selection meant prestige for the entire family line. One account describes a young woman, selected for sacrifice, who begged the priests not to drug her before death. She wanted to experience the transformation fully conscious, to carry complete awareness into the next world. Her request was granted. She climbed the mountain sober, participated fully in ceremonies, and accepted death while fully aware, believing she was becoming immortal. The tragedy isn't that she was stupid or primitive. The tragedy is that an entire civilization was so thoroughly convinced of a false cosmology that dying for it seemed logical. Fire temples dot the landscape of ancient Persia, eternal flames burning day and night, tended by priests who have devoted their lives to maintaining the sacred fires representing Ahura Mazda, the supreme god of truth and light. The year is 500 BCE, and Zoroastrianism, one of the world's first monotheistic religions, is approaching its peak influence. The religion will profoundly influence Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, introducing concepts of heaven and hell, angels and demons, a final judgment day, and the cosmic battle between good and evil. But beneath this theology of light lurks darkness that Zoroastrian apologists have spent centuries trying to obscure. The official narrative about Zoroastrianism emphasizes its ethical sophistication. Good thoughts, good words, good deeds. The religion taught that humans have free will to choose between truth, asha, and lie, dia arij, and that their choices matter cosmically. It's often presented as a purely ethical religion, focused on right behavior rather than bloody sacrifice. But the evidence suggests otherwise, particularly in the religion's earlier phases. The Avesta, Zoroastrianism's sacred text, includes sections called the Vendidad that describe purification rituals and religious obligations. Some passages are ambiguous, capable of multiple interpretations, but others are disturbingly specific. Chapter 19 discusses how to purify spaces contaminated by evil, describing rituals that include offerings to fire and to Ahura Mazda's divine warriors, the Amesha Spentas. The phrase Ratu of blood appears in several Avestan texts, referring to proper sacrificial offerings. While many scholars interpret this as referring exclusively to animal sacrifice, some passages suggest otherwise. The Middle Persian texts, written later but claiming to preserve ancient traditions, include references to the offering of the pure one and the sacrifice of the righteous, in contexts that are difficult to explain as purely animal offerings. Archaeological evidence from fire temples is ambiguous but suggestive. At Nakshi Rostam and other Persian religious sites, excavations have uncovered altars with drainage systems and ash pits that exceed what animal sacrifice alone would require. Chemical analysis of some ancient Persian religious sites shows traces of human blood mixed with animal blood, though this could potentially be from bloodletting rather than sacrifice. The Greek historians provide more direct testimony. Herodotus, describing Persian religious practices around 450 BCE, notes that Persians sacrifice animals, but adds cryptically that they have other customs concerning sacrifice which I know but think it better not to mention. This is the same Herodotus who freely describes human sacrifice among the Scythians, Thracians, and Egyptians. What did he learn about Persian practices that he felt compelled to censor? Strabo, writing later, mentions that some Persian religious sects practiced human sacrifice to Anahita, the Persian goddess of waters and fertility, though mainstream Zoroastrians condemned this practice. The archaeological record from Anahita temples shows evidence of large-scale offerings that may have included human victims. But the most disturbing evidence comes from the Zoroastrian concept of Krafstar, demonic creatures, or people who serve Angramainyu, Ahriman, the force of evil and chaos. The Vendidad explicitly states that Krafstar should be killed, not just defeated, but destroyed utterly. The text includes long lists of creatures considered Krafstar, certain insects, snakes, and, controversially, certain categories of humans. Heretics, apostates, and practitioners of forbidden arts are classified as Krafstar in some texts. And the prescribed treatment for Krafstar isn't imprisonment or conversion, it's elimination. Several passages suggest that killing Krafstar isn't murder, but purification, not a crime, but a religious duty. Did this theological categorization lead to actual human sacrifice? The evidence is circumstantial, but suggestive. Persian royal inscriptions describe how kings purified, conquered territories, and cleansed them of evil influences. Some scholars interpret this as referring to religious purges that may have involved ritualized killings of those deemed heretical. The Magi, the Zoroastrian priestly caste, had enormous power in Persian society. They controlled religious interpretation, performed all official sacrifices, and determined who was pure and who was polluted. Ancient sources describe the Magi as secretive, powerful, and willing to use violence to maintain religious orthodoxy. When Alexander the Great conquered Persia in 330 BCE, his soldiers reportedly found disturbing evidence in some fire temples, chambers that shouldn't have existed, ossuaries containing remains that exceeded normal burial practices, records of offerings that were deliberately ambiguous about what was being offered. The human detail that emerges from fragmentary sources. If human sacrifice existed in Zoroastrianism, it was likely justified not as offering to Ahura Mazda, who is good and wouldn't require such offerings, but as destruction of evil. The victims wouldn't have been innocent sacrifices, but condemned heretics, their deaths not offerings, but purifications. This theological distinction matters. It allowed the religion to condemn human sacrifice in principle while practicing it under another name. You're not sacrificing humans. You're eliminating demons that happen to wear human form. The death isn't an offering. It's cosmic house cleaning. This same logic appears in later religions. The Inquisition burning heretics, Calvinist witch trials, Islamic purges of apostates. The Zoroastrians may have pioneered this particular form of religious violence, killing humans not as offerings to gods, but as eliminations of evil, transforming murder into righteousness through doctrinal categorization. The practice declined as Zoroastrianism evolved and came under Greek and later Islamic influence. By the time Zoroastrian communities survived as minorities in Persia and India, whatever violent practices existed in earlier periods had been abandoned or so thoroughly suppressed that even knowledge of them was lost. Modern Zoroastrians would be horrified by suggestions that their ancient predecessors practiced human sacrifice. And perhaps they're right to be skeptical. The evidence is fragmentary, ambiguous, and filtered through hostile Greek sources. But the fragments that do survive suggest that even in one of humanity's most ethically sophisticated ancient religions, the logic of sacred violence found space to operate. The desert night is cold despite the day's heat, and stars fill the sky in quantities unimaginable to anyone who lives with electric lights. The year is approximately 550 CE. A generation before Muhammad's birth will transform Arabia forever. At the Kaaba in Mecca, not yet the focal point of Islam, but already a sacred site housing idols of multiple deities, pilgrims are gathering for a ceremony that Islam will soon abolish utterly. The official pre-Islamic history of Arabia tends to be written from Islamic sources describing the Jahiliyyah, the age of ignorance before Islam brought enlightenment. These sources have agendas, emphasizing the darkness of the pre-Islamic period to highlight the light of Islam. Separating historical fact from religious polemic is challenging, but multiple independent sources, Greek, Roman, Ethiopic, and early Islamic, agree on certain practices that characterized pre-Islamic Arabian religion, including forms of human sacrifice that persisted until Islam's emergence. The Arabs of the Jahiliyyah period practiced complex polytheism, worshipping various deities including Hubal, Al-Lat, Al-Uzza, and Manat. The Kaaba, a cube-shaped stone structure in Mecca, housed idols of numerous gods and was a pilgrimage site long before Islam. Pilgrims would circle the Kaaba, offer sacrifices, and seek the god's favor. The early Islamic sources are frank about pre-Islamic sacrifice, though they emphasize animal rather than human offerings, but several hadith collections and early biographies of Muhammad mention practices that clearly indicate human sacrifice occurred, even if not routinely. Ibn Ishaq's Sirat Rasul. Allah, the earliest surviving biography of Muhammad, references pre-Islamic customs including infanticide, the burial of infant daughters alive, which was apparently common enough that the Quran explicitly prohibits it, and when the girl, who was buried alive, is asked, for what sin was she killed? Quran 81:8-9. While this was likely motivated by poverty and gender preferences rather than explicit religious sacrifice, the practice had ritualistic elements and was performed at or near sacred sites. More directly, sacrificial practices are referenced in accounts of Abdul Muttalib, Muhammad's grandfather. According to multiple early sources, Abdul Muttalib made a vow that if he was blessed with 10 sons, he would sacrifice one of them to Hubal at the Kaaba. When his 10 sons reached adulthood, he drew lots to determine which would be sacrificed. The lot fell on his youngest and favorite son, Abdullah, Muhammad's father. The community intervened, suggesting he consult a diviner about whether Hubal would accept a substitute offering. After several divinations requiring increasing numbers of camels, Hubal supposedly accepted 100 camels in place of Abdullah. The story is told to highlight Muhammad's providential survival. If Abdullah had been sacrificed, Muhammad would never have been born. But the story only makes sense if human sacrifice to Hubal was understood as a legitimate vow. Nobody questions the premise of Abdul Muttalib's initial vow, only its execution. The negotiation is about substitution, not about whether offering a human to Hubal is acceptable. This suggests that human sacrifice, while perhaps not common, was within the boundaries of acceptable religious practice. Greek and Roman sources provide external corroboration. Porphyry, the 3rd century CE philosopher, mentions that Arabs sacrifice humans to the morning star, likely referring to Al-Uzza, who was associated with Venus. Lactantius, a Christian writer from the same period, claims that Arabs sacrifice boys to their gods. Archaeological evidence is sparse, but some exists. At Qataban and other South Arabian sites, excavations have uncovered remains suggesting ritual killing, though interpretation is contested. In the Hawlan region, inscriptions reference human offerings to various deities, using terminology that parallels sacrificial language for animals. The human detail emerges most clearly in poetry from the Jahiliyyah period, pre-Islamic Arabic poetry that survives because it's considered literature rather than religious text. Several poems reference sacrifice, blood offerings, and vows to deities that clearly involve human lives. One famous poem describes a warrior vowing his enemy's blood to Al-Uzza if she grants him victory. What makes the Arabian case unique? We can see the transition. Islamic sources preserve pre-Islamic practices explicitly to condemn them. We have a before and after snapshot of religious evolution, where human sacrifice is documented, then deliberately abolished, with the abolition itself becoming a point of religious pride. The Quran explicitly prohibits multiple pre-Islamic practices. And do not kill your children for fear of poverty, 1731. He has only forbidden you dead meat, blood, the flesh of swine, 2173. Early Islamic law codifies these prohibitions, making human sacrifice not just sinful, but legally punishable. Within a generation of Muhammad's death, human sacrifice had been so thoroughly eliminated from Arabian practice that it became almost unimaginable to Muslims that their ancestors had engaged in such acts. The speed and completeness of this transformation is remarkable. In less than 50 years, practices that had been acceptable became not just forbidden, but largely forgotten. But the archaeological and textual evidence confirms, in pre-Islamic Arabia, human life could be offered to the gods. The practice wasn't central to the religion the way it was for Aztecs or Carthaginians, but it existed as an option, a particularly extreme form of devotion or desperation. And then Islam swept it away. making the preservation of human life a fundamental religious value. Whatever else we might say about Islamic expansion in this particular area, it represented genuine moral progress. But before we celebrate too heartily, we should remember that the same Islam that abolished human sacrifice would, in later centuries, develop its own systems of religious violence, apostasy laws, honor killings, and warfare framed as religious obligation. The violence didn't disappear. It transformed, taking new forms justified by different theological logic. The pattern holds. Religious violence doesn't end because humans evolve beyond it. It ends when it's replaced by other forms of religious violence considered more acceptable, or when secular power structures emerge strong enough to suppress religious violence altogether. The stone faces of the Boyan temple stare down with enigmatic smiles, their serene expressions betraying nothing of the ceremonies conducted in the shadows of their massive heads. The year is approximately 1200 CE, at the height of the Khmer Empire's power, when Angkor was possibly the largest pre-industrial city in the world, when the temple complexes stretched across hundreds of square miles, when the kingdom controlled much of Southeast Asia. The official narrative about Angkor emphasizes its architectural brilliance. Angkor Wat, the largest religious monument ever built, the Bayon with its massive smiling faces, Ta Prohm with trees growing through its ruins, the sophisticated hydraulic systems, the artistic achievement, the fusion of Hindu and Buddhist traditions. The Khmer Empire was cultured, wealthy, and powerful, but carved into some of those temple walls, hidden in bas-reliefs that most tourists walk past without understanding, are scenes of religious practices that complicate the sanitized version. The evidence is primarily archaeological and iconographic, supplemented by limited textual sources. The Khmer left few written records compared to their architectural achievements, and what texts survive are mostly religious inscriptions praising kings and dedicating temples. They didn't write detailed accounts of their rituals, but they carved them into stone. At the Bayon, beneath the smiling faces, bas-reliefs depict scenes of military victory, daily life, and religious ceremonies. Among these are panels showing human figures in positions of submission before deities, scenes of ritual bloodletting, and what appear to be sacrificial offerings. Some figures are shown bound, others with weapons raised above them, still others in postures suggesting death or dying. Similar scenes appear at Bantae Chamar, another massive Khmer temple complex. The reliefs here are more explicit, captives being led in chains, figures with arms raised in supplication or fear, and scenes of ritual killing framed by religious symbolism. The kings are shown as divine warriors, and the defeated enemies are shown not just defeated, but offered to the gods. Chinese sources provide external perspective. Zhou Daguan, a Chinese diplomat who visited Angkor in 1296-1297, wrote an account of customs in Cambodia. He describes religious festivals involving large processions, elaborate ceremonies, and offerings to Hindu deities. He mentions that criminals are sometimes killed during these festivals, their deaths serving both judicial and religious functions. But the most direct evidence comes from excavations of the temples themselves. At Preah Khan, archaeologists discovered a chamber containing human remains in contexts suggesting ritual deposition rather than normal burial. The individuals had been arranged in specific patterns, accompanied by offerings, and showed signs of violent death. Similar findings have occurred at other Angkor sites, though excavations have been limited and often politically sensitive. The Khmer practiced a syncretic religion combining Hinduism and Buddhism, with the king occupying a divine role as Devaraja, God-king. The temples weren't just religious structures, they were cosmic diagrams made physical, representations of Mount Meru, the home of the gods, and the ordering of the universe. Everything in these temples carried symbolic meaning, including the offerings made there. Inscriptions at various temples reference offerings of life and blood consecrations, in language that's deliberately ambiguous. Are these animal sacrifices, human sacrifices, symbolic references to the king's divine power? Scholars debate, but the consistency of the phrasing across multiple sites suggests something more concrete than pure metaphor. One stela from Preah Khan, dating to the reign of Jayavarman VII, 1181 to 1218 CE, lists offerings made to the temple: cattle, rice, honey, oil, and servants for eternal duty. The last phrase could mean slaves assigned to temple service, or it could mean something more sinister: individuals offered to the gods for service in the afterlife, their deaths consecrating the sacred space. The human detail emerges in the Chinese accounts of Angkorian royal funerals. When kings died, elaborate ceremonies lasting weeks involved the cremation of the royal body, the destruction of valuable objects to send them to the afterlife, and the dedication of servants and concubines to accompany the king. Zhou Daguan's account suggests some of these dedications involved actual deaths, not just symbolic retirement from service. What makes the Khmer case particularly interesting: the empire was at its height during a period when much of the world was moving away from human sacrifice. The Khmer temples were being built contemporaneously with Gothic cathedrals in Europe during the Crusades, when Europe itself had largely, though not entirely, abandoned human sacrifice. The Khmer weren't primitive holdouts. They were a sophisticated civilization making conscious choices about religious practice. The practice seems to have declined as the Khmer Empire converted more thoroughly to Theravada Buddhism, which explicitly prohibits the taking of life. By the 14th century, when Buddhism became dominant, references to human offerings disappear from inscriptions. The temples built in later periods lack the ambiguous imagery of earlier structures. But during the empire's height, during the period when Angkor Wat and the Bayon were constructed, when Khmer power stretched across Southeast Asia, human sacrifice was apparently part of the religious landscape, not central, not constant, but present as an option for major consecrations, royal funerals, and moments of crisis. And then it faded, replaced by Buddhist nonviolence until even memory of the practice was lost. Modern Cambodians visiting Angkor see magnificent architecture and artistic achievement. They don't see, because they're not trained to look for it, the carved evidence that those achievements were consecrated with human blood. The silence around this topic is itself revealing. The Khmer case isn't widely discussed in popular histories of human sacrifice, isn't featured in documentaries, isn't taught in schools, partly because the evidence is ambiguous, requiring specialist knowledge to interpret, partly because Cambodia has suffered enough recent horrors that excavating ancient ones seems almost cruel, but partly because it disrupts comfortable narratives about Buddhist civilization being inherently peaceful. The evidence is there, carved in stone, waiting in excavation reports, preserved in Chinese accounts. But, like so many aspects of human sacrifice across cultures, it's been quietly buried under more palatable stories. The great enclosure rises from the African plain, its granite walls 30 feet high and built without mortar, stone fitted to stone with such precision that the structure has stood for 7 centuries. The year is approximately 1400 CE, and Great Zimbabwe is at the height of its power, controlling gold and ivory trade routes that stretch from the interior of Africa to the Indian Ocean coast. But inside these impressive walls, in chambers known only to the royal family and highest priests, ceremonies unfold that bind political power to blood. The Kingdom of Zimbabwe left no written records. What we know comes from archaeology, oral traditions recorded centuries later, and accounts from Portuguese traders who arrived after the kingdom's decline. The Portuguese found ruins and local populations who remembered the Great Stone City, who still performed ceremonies at the site, who spoke of the power of the ancestors who dwelled there. The official narrative about Great Zimbabwe emphasizes the architectural achievement, proof that complex African civilizations existed before European contact, evidence of sophisticated stoneworking technology and organized labor. The site became politically charged in the 20th century, symbol of African achievement against colonial narratives of African primitiveness. But the archaeological evidence, carefully examined, reveals practices that complicate simple narratives of either achievement or degradation. Great Zimbabwe was sophisticated and practiced human sacrifice. These aren't contradictions, they're both true. Excavations at the site, beginning in the late 19th century and continuing through the 20th, uncovered burial patterns that disturbed even the excavators. In the Great Enclosure and the Hill Complex, the 2 most sacred areas, archaeologists found human remains in ritual contexts, bodies carefully positioned at the bases of walls, remains interred with gold artifacts and carved soapstone birds, the symbol of royal power, and individuals who died simultaneously and were buried together. One excavation in the 1920s uncovered a chamber containing the remains of 8 individuals, 6 adults and 2 children, buried beneath the foundation of a major structure. The positioning suggested they hadn't been buried after death, but had been placed while the structure was being built, their deaths consecrating the building's foundation. Similar patterns appear in multiple structures across the site. The oral traditions recorded in the 19th and early 20th centuries are more explicit than the archaeology alone. Portuguese records from the 16th century, based on interviews with people from the Zimbabwe plateau, mention ceremonies where servants of the king are buried with him, and where blood is spilled to honor the ancestors who protect the realm. The Shona people, descendants of the Zimbabwe kingdom's builders, maintained religious practices into the colonial period that included offerings to ancestral spirits called mhondoro. While these practices as recorded involved animal sacrifice, elders interviewed in the early 20th century spoke of old customs that had been abandoned, customs involving human offerings to the mhondoro of particularly powerful kings. The pattern fits what we know of African divine kingship more broadly. In many African societies, the king wasn't just a political ruler, but a sacred figure whose life force sustained the community. When that force waned through age, illness, or defeat, the king had to be replaced, sometimes violently. And when a powerful king died, his transition to the ancestor world required accompaniment. At Great Zimbabwe, the evidence suggests that major building projects, the expansion of walls, the construction of new enclosures, were dedicated through sacrifice. The individuals whose remains are found in foundation contexts weren't accident victims or plague casualties. They were offerings, their deaths transforming profane stone into sacred architecture, their spirits binding the walls together more firmly than mortar ever could. One particularly haunting detail from the archaeological record: several of the individuals found in ritual contexts show evidence of having been well fed and well cared for before death. These weren't disposable slaves or war captives worked to death. They were valuable people, possibly even volunteers from elite families, whose sacrifice carried weight precisely because of their value. Imagine being chosen for this honor, to be buried beneath the great enclosure, to become part of the most important structure in the kingdom, to have your spirit dwelling in the stone for eternity. Is this an honor or a horror? In the context of a society that believed the ancestors actively protected and guided the living, that the spirit world and physical world were intimately connected, sacrificing yourself to become a guardian, spirit might have seemed like transformation rather than death. The kingdom of Zimbabwe declined in the 15th century for reasons still debated, possibly drought, possibly depletion of gold sources, possibly political fragmentation. By the time the Portuguese arrived in the 16th century, the site was already largely abandoned. Whatever practices occurred there during its height had already ended, leaving only stone walls and scattered bones to tell the story. The Zimbabwean government, understandably, has been cautious about publicizing evidence of human sacrifice at Great Zimbabwe. The site is a national symbol, a source of pride and identity, proof of African historical achievement. Acknowledging that this achievement coexisted with human sacrifice complicates the narrative in ways that might feed racist stereotypes. But the evidence exists, and refusing to acknowledge it doesn't honor the victims. It erases them. The people whose bones lie beneath those magnificent walls deserve to have their stories told, even if those stories are uncomfortable, even if they complicate our preferred narratives about the past. The truth is that Great Zimbabwe was a remarkable achievement of architecture, organization, and power, and part of that power was maintained through religious violence. Both facts can be true simultaneously. The architecture doesn't become less impressive because it was consecrated with blood, and the sacrifice doesn't become less tragic because it occurred in a sophisticated society. This is the pattern we've seen throughout this exploration. Complexity and violence coexist. Sophistication and sacrifice aren't opposites. They're companions. The most architecturally advanced civilizations, the most theologically complex religions, the most organized societies, they all found room for human sacrifice when the religious logic demanded it. And that brings us to the final case, the one that perhaps best illustrates how deeply human sacrifice embedded itself in ancient cultures, how publicly it was practiced, how central it was to society's functioning. We've discussed the Phoenician Tophet at Carthage, the child sacrifices to Baal Hammon. But Carthage was just one city in a vast Phoenician network, and Baal Hammon was just one of several deities who demanded blood. To truly understand Phoenician sacrifice, we need to look at the broader system, the theology, the economics, the social functions that made child sacrifice not an aberration, but a central feature of Phoenician civilization for more than 6 centuries. The sun beats down on the ancient city of Byblos on the Lebanese coast, where Phoenician culture first emerged. The year is approximately 1200 BCE, and in a sacred precinct near the harbor, priests are preparing offerings to Baal and his consort Astarte. The scent of incense mingles with smoke from the altar, and in the crowd of worshippers, wealthy merchants clutch the hands of their children, knowing that their success in trade has incurred debts to the gods. The Phoenicians were history's first true maritime empire, establishing colonies from Cyprus to Spain, controlling Mediterranean trade routes, developing the alphabetic writing system that would become the basis for Greek, Latin, and eventually most modern scripts. They were culturally sophisticated, economically dominant, and religiously devout. And they burned children alive, not occasionally, not in times of desperate crisis, but systematically, regularly, as a normal part of religious and social life. The archaeological evidence is overwhelming. Tophet sites, sacred precincts specifically dedicated to child sacrifice, have been excavated at every major Phoenician colony: Carthage in Tunisia, Motia and Solsis in Sardinia, Theros in Sardinia, Hadrumetum in Tunisia, and multiple sites in Lebanon. The pattern is consistent: urns containing cremated infant remains, stelae erected above them recording the offerings, layers of deposits spanning centuries. The Carthage Tophet alone contains an estimated 20,000 plus burial urns deposited over roughly 600 years. That's an average of 33 child sacrifices per year, every year, for 6 centuries. Some years were undoubtedly higher. During crises, the rate increased dramatically. But this wasn't occasional practice. This was industrial-scale child sacrifice. The inscriptions provide staggering detail about the practice's social function. Wealthy families erected elaborate stelae commemorating their offerings, essentially bragging about their piety. The inscriptions follow formulas but include personal details. To the Lady Tanit and to the Lord Baal Hammon, that which name, son of name, vowed because they heard his voice and blessed him. The passive voice, because they heard, implies the gods responded positively to previous prayers, and the child's death is payment for those blessings. Some stelae include more specific information: for a son, for a daughter, for a business venture, for a ship that returned safely. The gods are addressed transactionally. You give us prosperity, we give you our children. It's a market exchange, cosmic capitalism, where human lives are the currency of divine favor. The victims' ages varied, but tended young. Isotopic analysis shows most were under 3 months old, many were newborns, and a significant percentage were premature or stillborn. This has led some scholars to propose the secular cemetery theory, that the Tophet was simply where the Phoenicians buried infants who died naturally, and the sacrificial language is metaphorical. But multiple lines of evidence contradict this theory. First, the inscriptions explicitly describe these as offerings, not natural deaths. Second, many urns contain the remains of 2 or 3 children simultaneously, suggesting they weren't family burials, but grouped sacrifices. Third, the proportion of young infants is too high. Even with high ancient infant mortality, the age distribution doesn't match natural mortality patterns. Fourth, separate Phoenician cemeteries exist where older children and adults were buried normally. And fifth, multiple ancient sources explicitly describe child sacrifice as a Phoenician practice. The classical sources are consistent and detailed. Diodorus Siculus describes the mechanism: the bronze statue with outstretched arms, heated from within, onto which children were placed to roll into the fire below. Plutarch adds the detail about drums and flutes drowning out screams. Tertullian, writing in the 2nd century CE, mentions that the practice continued in North Africa even after Roman conquest, forcing authorities to repeatedly suppress it. In Africa, infants were openly sacrificed to Saturn, Baal Hammon, until the proconsulate of Tiberius, who exposed the priests themselves on the same trees that overshadowed their temple. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect is how the practice intersected with social class. The archaeological evidence shows that wealthy families made the largest offerings and erected the most elaborate monuments. Poor families, unable to afford their own children's sacrifice, purchased children from others. The MLK-MR inscriptions, substitute lamb, documenting the use of purchased children as stand-ins for families' biological offspring. Think about what this means economically. There was a market in sacrificial children. Some families bred children for sale to others for sacrifice. Some families kidnapped children and sold them to the temples. Some families, facing starvation, sold their children to wealthy families who needed sacrificial offerings. An entire economy built around producing, trading, and consuming human children for religious purposes. And this wasn't hidden or shameful. The Tophet sites were in city centers, near harbors and temples, in high-traffic areas. The stelae were public art, meant to be seen and admired. When Phoenician merchants traveled to other cities, they brought these practices with them, establishing Tophet sites in colonies across the Mediterranean. Practice was so normalized that, when outsiders objected, the Phoenicians were genuinely confused. To them, offering one's child to Baal Hammon was like offering one's wealth to build a temple, or one's time to religious service. A sacrifice, yes, but an expected sacrifice, a necessary sacrifice, a beautiful sacrifice that demonstrated both devotion and status. The human detail that emerges from studying the urns themselves. Many contain not just bones, but elaborate offerings, jewelry, amulets, tiny carved figures. These weren't disposable offerings thrown into a pit. Care was taken with each burial, each urn carefully sealed, each offering precisely positioned. The parents weren't monsters. They were devout believers performing what they genuinely believed was the highest form of worship. One inscription, more personal than most, reads, "To the Lady Tanit and to the Lord Baal Hammon, that which Bodmelkart, son of Mago, vowed for his son, his own flesh, for he heard his voice and blessed him." The phrase "his own flesh" appears occasionally in the inscriptions, emphasizing that this is the father's biological child, not a purchased substitute. It reads almost like a boast. I was wealthy enough that I could have bought a substitute, but I offered my own son because my devotion is genuine. Did Bodmelkart love his son? Almost certainly. Did offering that son to Baal Hammon destroy him emotionally? Possibly. But he did it anyway, because his religion demanded it, because his society expected it, because his entire worldview was structured around the belief that the gods required this sacrifice, and that failure to provide it would result in even greater tragedy. And therein lies perhaps the most disturbing lesson of the Phoenician case. Human sacrifice doesn't require inhuman perpetrators. It requires ordinary people convinced by their society, their religion, and their culture that killing their children is not just acceptable, but necessary, even noble. The practice ended when Rome destroyed Carthage in 146 BCE, but it had already been declining as Phoenician colonies came under Greek and Roman influence. The last documented child sacrifice at the Carthage Tophet dates to approximately 150 BCE, just before the final siege. By then, the practice had already become controversial even among Phoenicians, with some families offering animal substitutes or ceramic dolls instead of real children. But for 6 centuries, the smoke rose from Phoenician altars, carrying the burnt offerings of children skyward to gods who, the Phoenicians believed, heard their prayers and blessed them with prosperity. The ruins of the Tophets remain. In Carthage, the site is now a peaceful garden with scattered stelae, popular with tourists who often don't realize they're walking on ground where thousands of children were killed. In Motia, the Tophet overlooks the harbor, the stone markers visible from the water where Phoenician ships once sailed, laden with goods purchased, through the gods' favor, secured by the blood of their children. And we're forced to confront an uncomfortable question. If the Phoenicians, sophisticated, literate, wealthy, culturally advanced, could convince themselves that burning their children alive was holy, what does that say about humanity's capacity for moral reasoning? What does it say about the power of religion to transform horror into virtue? What does it say about how easily entire societies can normalize the unthinkable? The moonlight dances across the waters of Lake Stymphalia as the Temple of Artemis rises from the darkness. The air is thick with myrrh and something metallic. Young women in white chitons move through the sacred grove, torches casting shadows on ancient oaks. At the front walks the high priestess, her face painted white, carrying a silver bow. Behind her, surrounded by virgin priestesses, walks the offering. The official story tells us that Artemis was the protector of young women, guardian of childbirth and nature. Her temples were sanctuaries, her priestesses were healers, her worship was pure. That's what they wanted you to believe. In 1906, British archaeologists excavating at the sanctuary of Artemis Orthia in Sparta found something that would challenge everything we thought we knew about Greek religion. Beneath layers of Roman construction, they discovered the original temple dating to the 8th century BCE, and around it, human remains. Dozens of them. The bones showed signs of ritual violence, precise cuts consistent with ceremonial knives, positioning that suggested binding, trauma patterns that matched descriptions in ancient texts. Scholars had always assumed were metaphorical, but the most disturbing discovery was the altar itself. The altar stone was stained dark with what chemical analysis confirmed was human blood. Not animal blood, human blood. Layers of it, centuries of it, soaked so deeply into the porous limestone that it had become part of the rock itself. The altar had grooves carved into its surface, channels designed to collect blood and funnel it into a depression at the center. From there, another channel led to a collection vessel that still contained residue testing positive for human hemoglobin. This wasn't some barbaric impulse. This was engineering, ritual refined over generations. And it wasn't just Sparta. Similar evidence emerged from the Temple of Artemis at Broron outside Athens, at Taurus in Crimea, and at Ephesus, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. At Broron, the sanctuary was primarily a cult site for young girls between 5 and 10 who served as bears of Artemis. It was seen as an honor, but beneath the temple, archaeologists found something that shattered that innocent interpretation: a mass grave containing remains of over 30 young girls. The bones showed evidence of malnutrition, prolonged captivity, and violence. Skulls with fractures, ribs with cut marks, cervical vertebrae showing damage consistent with throat cutting. The ancient writers knew about it. Euripides wrote of Iphigenia, nearly sacrificed by her own father at Aulis before Artemis substituted a deer, except the archaeological evidence from Aulis tells us she didn't. They found remains matching Iphigenia's description: a young woman, 15 to 17 years old, killed by a single blow to the base of the skull, the method described as the proper way to sacrifice to Artemis. Her bones dated to the 13th century, BCE, right around the traditional date of the Trojan War. The myth wasn't covering up a miracle, it was covering up a murder. At Ephesus, excavations beneath the temple revealed a hidden chamber, accessed only through a secret entrance beneath the altar. Inside that chamber, they found bones, female bones. Young women who had been dressed as brides led to the temple and sealed inside to die in darkness, wed to the goddess forever. The latest datable bones are from the 2nd century CE. For nearly 1,000 years, this continued. Why would families give their children to such a fate? The inscriptions offer answers. Families who gave a child to Artemis received tax exemptions, grants of land, political appointments. But there was also religious terror. Artemis was powerful, capricious, easily angered. The goddess demanded sacrifice, and the price of refusing was too high. The cult finally declined in the 3rd and 4th centuries CE as Christianity spread. The last recorded sacrifice at a sanctuary of Artemis occurred in 381 CE. The priestess who performed it was arrested and executed. The cult that had endured for over 1,500 years ended with a sword. So, we come to the end of this journey through darkness, having explored 25 ancient religious cults that practiced human sacrifice. From the pyramids of the Aztecs to the megaliths of Britain, from the ziggurats of Sumer to the mountain peaks of the Andes, we've followed a trail of blood that spans continents and millennia. What have we learned? First, human sacrifice wasn't rare or isolated. It was near universal, appearing independently in virtually every complex society during its development. This wasn't coincidence or cultural borrowing. It was convergent evolution, different societies reaching the same solution to the fundamental problem of how to communicate with and influence divine powers. Second, Sophistication and sacrifice coexist comfortably. The most architecturally advanced civilizations, the most literate societies, the most organized empires, they all practiced human sacrifice during their peaks. The Aztecs who built Tenochtitlan practiced it. The Phoenicians who invented the alphabet practiced it. The Inca, who engineered roads across mountain ranges, practiced it. Intelligence, education, and cultural achievement don't immunize against religious violence. Sometimes they enable it, providing sophisticated theological frameworks that make the violence seem not just acceptable, but necessary. Third, the victims weren't always innocent in the modern sense. Many were volunteers, true believers, who accepted their deaths as transformative rather than terminal. They weren't stupid or brainwashed. They were operating within belief systems where sacrifice made sense, where death served cosmic purposes, where their ending was actually a beginning. The tragedy isn't that they were forced. The tragedy is that they weren't. Fourth, the line between civilization and barbarism isn't as clear as we want to believe. Every civilization we've examined had multiple faces. The public face of architectural marvels and artistic achievement, the private face of blood-soaked altars and screaming victims. Both are real. Both deserve acknowledgement. Refusing to see the darkness doesn't honor the light. It dishonors the victims whose deaths were obscured. And finally, perhaps most importantly, these practices ended not because humans suddenly became more moral, but because power structures shifted. The Aztecs didn't abandon sacrifice voluntarily. The Spanish forced them to stop. The Carthaginians didn't develop ethical objections. Rome destroyed them. The Celts didn't reason their way out of human sacrifice. Christian missionaries and Roman legions imposed new beliefs at sword point. Dahomies sacrificed children until French colonial forces made it impossible to continue.